Mama,
Hello and welcome to Chats, a television podcast, Season 8B, RootsChatz. My name is Alan, and I'm joined, as always, by Magellan.
Hey, what's up?
Chicken butt. I will never... Okay, what's up is a hard question to answer. This is the beginning of my Tight 5. I'm a stand-up comedian. Welcome to my show.
You ever notice this?
Another...
Has this ever happened to you?
Yeah, my Tight 5 is just the beginning of stories that comedians would tell. Now, the thing about... I'm not racist, but...
Somebody did that, and I can't remember who it was.
Oh, of course. Was it like, yeah, probably some like internet stand-up or internet like sketch group was like, what if this comedian...
It's somebody that you've heard of before.
Okay.
But I can't remember who it was. But the whole bit is like... And then I was like, oh, come on. But then it was like, what? Like that kind of thing. But I can't remember who it was. It was like,
it had to be
it was
Scott
like Andy
Aukerman.
Daly. It was like Andy Daly, I think. Or, yeah.
Oh,
Andy Daly, fake stand-up. He's like a Comedy Bang Bang person.
Right. Not Scott himself. Because I feel like that sounds like
but
a
it
Scott
was
bit.
somebody in that orbit.
Yeah. How much
and
do I have to fight
think-
the Hollywood elite to end up in the Comedy Bang Bang orbit? Because that's really all I wanted when I was
I know, right? That's the dream. Yeah, it is. It's Andy Daly as a character of his, Jerry O'Hearn, a comedian who says nothing for 5 minutes and kills. Unbelievable.
Oh, I like that. That's how I'm
Yeah.
trying to be.
Yeah, so you
But
can
anyways,
check that out on your own time.
It is very hot out. We pushed the hundreds this weekend where I'm at, which is bad, and it's really humid, and they're still shooting off fireworks. And now I sound like old man yells at cloud, so I'm gonna stop complaining. How's your corner of the universe going, Marge?
It's okay. I'm in the doldrums of being on summer break, and I didn't think my life could get any more structureless, but it really has. And I think I'm starting to bottom out.
There's only so many episodes of Community, my friend.
Yeah, well, I'm on my second full watch, about to end season 4 for the second time, so
Baby.
I don't think I'll watch it a third time.
I mean, is this technically your third time because you watched it when it aired?
Yeah, I mean,
but in this, like,
in a row, yeah.
Sure. You gotta get caught up. Like you were telling me, you want it to be in the same space as The Simpsons, where you can just drop the jokes.
Yeah, maybe I'll watch The Simpsons next. Maybe I'll revisit.
That's a fun watch.
Those episodes that I used to fall asleep to as a young child.
As a young lad. They just recently re-uploaded The Simpsons to Disney Plus with the correct
Didn't they fix the thing that everybody was complaining about that I didn't notice?
You're such a boomer. The thing that all the stupid teens were whining about that doesn't matter ultimately.
Yeah, what was it, like aspect ratio
yes,
or something?
It
I don't
cut
care
off
about aspect ratio.
Yes, you do. It cuts off parts of the whole screen, but jokes are missed because of that, and the color grading was off.
I especially don't care about that.
Oh, come on. You don't
I just don't like it when people complain about things without substance.
That for some people, that's substance.
Okay.
My big thing this week is that I'm not letting things that I disagree with go without being addressed. So we can no longer.
Have you been doing that for the last 5 years?
No, now it's just I'm going to open up a Pandora's box of all the stuff I've disagreed with and never said out loud. So
you unfurl this huge scroll.
Yeah.
And you're like, in the first episode of Farscape, you said...
You said hi, and I told you to say hello before we started, and I'm still mad about that. No, it ends up meaning like you just realize, okay, there's less stuff that really needs to bother me, but when it does, I'm going to talk about it, and it'll be good.
That's interesting.
Yeah. But speaking of talking, things that we can talk about include 1977's Roots, which Magellan and I have been watching 2 episodes a week of for the past couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And today on RootsChatz, we are discussing the final 2 episodes of the original Roots series, which are parts 5 and 6 if you're watching in the 90-minute chunks like we did. Let's get right into it. Part 5 was written for TV by James Lee and William Blinn. It was directed by Gilbert Moses. It originally aired January 28th, 1977. And Magellan, can you tell me what happens in this episode of Roots, please?
Sure. In this episode, Chicken George is sent to England as payment for his owner's gambling debt. 14 years later, he returns home a free man, a status that has a profound effect on the family begun by Kunta Kinte. The Civil War erupts. At last, the era of slavery draws to an end. And then you wrote, editor's note, no, it doesn't.
Not even close. The show is about how it doesn't. Like, come on, guys.
I don't know, actually. I mean, well, we can talk about it.
The industry changes.
Yeah.
It's a different name. Sharecropping. No, we'll get into it.
Yeah, but I mean, I think the show doesn't take as strong a stance on that as I expected it to.
I agree.
Just for clarity's sake, for folks who, if for some reason you have access to a version of Roots that's like the original airing order of the different parts, we're watching the re-edited version for home video release, where part 5 consists of the second half of the original part 6 and part 7. So this whole stretch of the story goes from 1841 to 1865.
So the last episode ended with us discussing Chicken George jumping up in the air saying he likes his master. Then we get half of that story, the rest of it in the next part, and going into the story of Tom. So through the end of Tom's story for now, or the end of either version of the series. So that's good to delineate for folks. But part 5, episode 5, whatever you want to call it, mostly concerns our pal Chicken George. What did you think about his story? I know it sounded like off air you had some issues with sort of his the sort of moral direction that his story takes.
I mean, I think I voiced some of this last week, but generally I enjoy Ben Vereen's performance. I think he does a pretty good job, and I think he explores a wide emotional range in this episode that we'll talk about. And the story takes some turns in this episode that I appreciated with regard to George's relationship with Tom Moore. Mm-hmm. But I think my general issue with it is just an issue with this sort of like rags to riches idea that it is somewhat endorsing. I think it's a little more complex than that, but the aspects of this that are sort of saying like, hey, if you save your money, you can buy your own freedom and capitalism will set you free kind of, I have major qualms with, especially, when we get to the second episode and we see that capitalism can be twisted and turned to like keep people in perpetual oppression. So
that part really got me.
Yeah. So I generally liked it, but with that sort of reservation in the back of my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think one of the historical backdrop of this episode and where we're at, because we open on May of 1841, and I think the stuff that Chicken George bumps into historically, mainly the Nat Turner's Rebellion and all of that stuff and how it's affecting the world around him as the United States is slowly changing, and then when the Civil War starts by the next episode, you're seeing the world kind of like take a different view or a sort of changing view on slavery and on enslaved people like as entities with agency. That I think is really interesting, and you're watching that at the backdrop of this person who's just trying to succeed and find happiness, even though they know that they're not going to be free in their lifetime. So I like that stuff.
This episode is really kind of about like what are the things that continue to get in the way of there being any sort of peaceful coexistence between black people and white people. And I think a question that ends up coming up in the second episode as well is like, is there such thing as a good white person within the scope of all of this? Because we obviously know Tom Moore is not a good white person.
Right, absolutely.
I would say he's a particularly bad white person. But George certainly thinks he's a good person, and then sees the ways in which that's not true, and sees the ways in which the system incentivizes Tom Moore to do evil things, his wife as well. So yeah, I wanted to talk about the sort of ways in which this miniseries is depicting Nat Turner's rebellion shifting things, because I think that it occupies really the first like 15, 20 minutes or so of the episode. And I think that it's important to talk about that historical context. But I will say something that bothered me
Right.
is that the real Nat Turner's rebellion happened in 1831. And
That would have been 10 years earlier than this episode's beginning.
right. And in the book, from what I could tell, the years were correct. So I don't know what happened in the creation of the miniseries, like if they shifted some things around or what, for dramatic effect or something. I'm not sure, but it's wrong. Like the episode clearly says at the beginning that it's 1841, and everyone's talking about Nat Turner's rebellion. And I was like, what the heck is going on?
As if it's like literally happening. Yeah, because at
Yeah,
first I know
they talk about like, oh, Nat Turner just got caught, and those guys are looking for him and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I know in your notes you were like, oh, they must be like, it really must have lingered in the hearts and minds of these people how like anxious they are about the idea of their of their enslaved folk like rising up and attacking and killing them. And it's like, oh, according to the show, it happened like yesterday, and they're like down the street or something.
Yeah.
And then it ends. Do you mind giving just a little bit of like 101 historical context for Nat Turner's Rebellion?
Yeah, so Nat Turner's Rebellion takes place in 1831 in Virginia. I can't remember what state we're in right now. I think it's Virginia as well, actually. But I'm not sure.
I don't know, yeah, unfortunately. They move around a lot is the problem, but I forget where Tom Moore's like plantation is. Yeah,
but so it's an insurrection or whatever you want to call it. I mean, rebellion, revolution. These words are kind of fluid, but it's generally called Nat Turner's Rebellion, and it's a violent rebellion led by this man Nat Turner, who has certain ideas about being sent by God and all these sorts of things. He's inspired to a certain extent by the religious revivalism of something called the Second Great Awakening, which captured the minds and hearts of American people across the country from like the 1790s to the 1840s or so, and essentially created this, through the spread of religion, created this sense of like, oh, society is perfectible in a way, and like, religion became more democratic to a certain extent. I mean, you can get into nuanced historical conversations about if that's true or not, but Nat Turner's Rebellion is kind of a part of that conversation where Nat Turner essentially believes, rightfully so, that slavery is inherently abhorrent to God's vision, and he sort of has these ideas about his mission as an agent of the Lord or whatever. So he leads a group of enslaved people who escape the plantation that they're on, and then end up going around to different white families and murdering people. So around 55 to 65 people are killed, 51 of them for sure being white. So what the characters talk about in this, Tom Moore's wife talking about, oh my gosh, they went around and they killed families, they're killing children, whatever, those things are true. Mm-hmm. Because in Nat Turner's eyes, all white people, by engaging in the system of slavery and enslaving people, are evil, and they need to be sort of killed in order to expunge that evil. So it ends up lasting for a couple days. Nat Turner and the people with him go on the run. They're eventually captured and executed for what they did as a part of Nat Turner's Rebellion.
So it's an interesting example and to contextualize like what a violent rebellion looked like at the time. And what we see in the show is how many of the white characters take that and are terrified of it and use it as an excuse to further abuse their own enslaved people, and others use it as sort of vindication that like this is a good practice and we need to snuff this out before it like upends our very system of living and existence. So
yeah. And the context of kind of events like this in American history. So, I mean, all the way back to the 1600s, there was this event called, oh my God, Bacon's Rebellion, in like colonial Virginia, where white indentured servants and enslaved people banded together in a rebellion against white plantation owners. And that was an event that sort of catalyzed the idea of like, okay, we need to make sure that we don't have white people working alongside African American people, because that sort of creates a class solidarity and a class consciousness that's dangerous to the power of wealthy plantation owners, which you can sort of see in the character of Old George, who we'll meet in the second episode, I think. Right? Or does he show up in the first one?
Well, my split is weird, so
okay.
We'll it's in the first one.
Yeah. So that's that rebellion, and then Nat Turner's rebellion is actually the event that inspires many Southern states to officially codify. And this had been the practice in a number of different places, and may have been law in certain places, but it's almost universally codified after Nat Turner's rebellion that it's illegal to teach enslaved people to read or write.
Right.
Because Nat Turner being able to read and to write scripture, is one of the reasons that he was inspired to do what he did.
Right. Thinking about Nat Turner's Rebellion got me interested again in looking at what's the name of the film? The 2016 one that's
Birth
about
of a Nation.
Birth of it. The 2016 version of Birth of a Nation is specifically about that and what a violent revolution looks like. And obviously, when we talk about the Roots remake, we'll talk about also like what 2016 looks like, and in terms of like race relations in the United States. But at a different time, like the choice to focus on the violence of it was one of the many, many controversial things about that film. And so in this series, it's violence that happened off screen, but it directly affects the characters and the storylines happening on our interpersonal level, which I think works a lot better than, and this is also, these are two different deliberate ways of telling backstory, but like in the previous episodes when they say, oh, the founding fathers like are, the Revolutionary War is happening and we're not there for it because we're not directly fighting in it, that kind of thing. But I thought it was really fascinating, again, how everyone's afraid of it and people are using it to kind of vindicate more horrible actions, like Tom Moore's wife, who straight up shoots at Chicken George as he's driving Tom back on a carriage, and Tom Moore is passed out because he's an alcoholic and he's drunk, and she shoots him because she thinks that he's A, with Nat Turner, and B, killed her husband. Yeah. And so she's terrified, which is bad, and he gets in trouble. But later on, he's talking to Kizzy, his mom, and we also meet his two children, Tom and Lewis.
Yeah.
Who's so good when he gets older, by the way, the actor plays him.
I agree.
And he talks about, and basically, like you had mentioned in your notes, Kizzy's telling him, you can't trust him no matter how much you say he's your friend. When it becomes convenient for him, it's not going to go in your direction. And then just like that, as if she snapped her fingers, Tom Moore kicks open the door with a shotgun pointed at them and says, hey guys, if any of you decide to join up with Nat Turner or even think about it or read about it, you're dead. And basically she kind of can turn to George and say, what did I just say?
Right. Told you so.
And it continues to get really sad because George's big plan is that he wants to buy his own freedom as well as the freedom of his children, his mom and his wife. And it's this really, really sad scene where he's kind of tabulating how much it would cost precisely to buy all of their freedom. And to just have to itemize your family like that is truly, truly dehumanizing in a way that we haven't explicitly seen in this way, because it's not just other people telling them what they're worth. It's them like having to come to terms with like, yeah, my son's probably worth more because he's not in his working years yet. And my mom
he says to his wife, like, you're still young enough to be a breeder.
Right. Ugh. Just the way they have to swallow down that sentence is again, like Ben Vereen bringing it.
Yeah, he makes this joke, this really well done turn in his performance, where he makes this joke of like, oh, and I figured he'd throw in my mom for free, and like almost cutting himself off. He's like 500 for her.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that whole scene I thought was really well done.
Yeah. And then we get probably we get to one of the most dramatic, intense scenes of these episodes, which is I'm trying to remember what exactly. So they find the guy outside, right? The dead black man.
Yeah, and he has a gun on his person.
He has a gun on his person, and George is so mad because, what are we going to do with this? I'm scared. I'm worried about my family and all this stuff. I'm trying to remember what exactly is the point where he decides that he wants to kill Tom Moore.
So, yeah, it's like a couple steps really that turn George against Tom Moore in this, because he starts the episode basically saying to his mom like, "Oh, Tom Moore's been nothing but a friend to me," and he really at the beginning of the episode he's at this cockfight and he's considers himself like best friends with Tom Moore, and Tom Moore considers him that way too. At least he says so, which obviously is not the case. Mm-hmm. But because as Kizzy says to George later, like, I used to think that a white person was my best friend once, and she wasn't. So don't believe that.
Right.
But George is living a pretty comfortable life, working for Moore and being his like head chicken trainer person. To the extent that the guy who he meets at the beginning, who has bought his own freedom, is like, George, you should like be saving your money for that instead of buying like cool hats and scarves. Because George has his like signature big green scarf and this very stylish bowler hat. Yeah, the other enslaved man is like, you're wasting your money on that and like gifts for your family. The only thing that really matters is freedom. And George is like, yeah, whatever. But then he's thinking about it and he starts thinking like, okay, well, I could save this money, that money. Then like you were saying before, when Tom Moore points a shotgun in his face, he's like, okay, that's strike one.
Yeah.
And what ends up happening that totally turns George against Tom Moore is there was a white guy at the beginning who George runs into, who's another like cockfighting guy, who comes back and is like, hey, George, I want to buy you and your family so that you can train chickens for me, because I'm going to host this like huge cockfighting tournament where the prize is like $30,000 or something. And I want you to help me win it. And if you do that, then I'll let you keep your share of the money. And in 5 years, you'll be free, which is very exciting news for George.
Of course.
And so he goes to talk to Tom Moore about it. And Tom is basically like, oh, I'm not going to sell you. You belong to me. I'm not going to do that.
I'm not giving you that opportunity.
Yeah. And then in that conversation, what George realizes is that even if he were to save the money, and this is what adds nuance to sort of what I was saying about before, about this sort of like capitalism setting you free from slavery, is you have to have a slave owner who's like willing to make that agreement. And if you don't, then no amount of money in the world is going to force them to make a particular decision. So George realizes in that conversation, like, oh, okay, Tom Moore is never going to agree to let me buy my freedom. So then he goes to grab the gun to kill him because he can't think of what else to do.
Okay, and that's where Kizzy is like, you need to stop. You'd be killing your own family. Has the like, I know this is a really crass comparison, but has the like Empire Strikes Back moment of like, you're killing family. Yeah, he's your father. Right. He's your father. Like,
right.
And it's obviously much, 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 much darker because he's the product of rape, and this is a person who also owns him and his mother, And so he kind of is at odds where he's like, I still should kill him, but now he's my dad. And, he gets even more horrible.
Yeah, he has more reason to kill him by learning about what
he's done
to his mother, and more reason to not kill him because it's like, okay, it's my dad, which I guess it seems to be implied that would be like especially morally bad, because Kizzy says you'd be damned by your own sin forever,
right?
As if it's like a worse sin to kill a family member or your father as opposed to just murder in general, which is itself a sin.
Yeah, the way that this series now is like portraying the murder of white folks as like, when Nat Turner does it, it's scary, but we all kind of should understand, maybe as a modern audience, that in a lot of ways that was necessary in terms of pushing the conversation forward. But when when George talks about killing Tom Moore, and when later his son does successfully kill someone, it's like framed as this horrible, like, your life is ruined, you've committed a grave sin sort of thing. Whether that's by the show implying that is a bad thing, or by the understanding that this is just going to be bad for them, is kind of ambiguous in a way that I don't love.
Yeah, that's a good point, because you can see in the later example where George's son, kills one of the Brent brothers. It's sort of partly painted as bad because it's like, okay, now hell's going to rain down on him when people find out that he did this. So he's putting himself and his family in danger by doing that. But there's also the implication that like he's somehow tainted his soul or something by committing murder. And that's certainly what's going on in this scene with George and Kizzy. And yeah, I agree. I don't know how to feel about that, because it's sort of like the lesson seems to be you'll be as bad as them if you do this, which is just I think that's a false equivalency.
I agree.
I can't necessarily sit here and condone murder, but also if someone has kept you and your entire family enslaved for years and done unspeakably horrible things to you, to your mother, to your children, to your wife, to whoever, and will continue to do so, I don't think that killing them makes you as bad as them.
I mean, I agree. As a proponent of revolutionary violence as a means to an end, I also agree. But it's not even that. Like, it's not even like I'm trying to make a change by killing this person. It's literally like, in Tom's case, a sort of retribution and a sort of a revenge. And then in George's case, it's like, similarly, like, this person is horrible to me and abusive and part of an industry that has ruined my life and my family's life for many generations.
Yeah, in the case at the end of the episode with Tom, George's son, it sort of feels like self-defense that then he continues past the point of self-defense. And in George's case, he's angry, and rightfully so. But he's also not in like imminent physical danger in the moment where he decides that he wants to do this.
And the show takes some time to focus on the sadness of that before we move on to the introduction of another guest cast that I was really surprised to see, which is Ian McShane as this floppy British chicken fighter who is at one of the competitions and seems like he's going to be a bad person. We get a lot of like, and we're establishing that there's now a big cultural divide between people who
definitely didn't recognize that was Ian McShane.
I read about it in the credits because I had this episode with the previous part, so I saw Ian McShane in the credits, and I was looking for him. But yeah, that's a very young Ian McShane.
Wow, yeah, I'm looking at it now.
Once you know it, you're like, oh, duh, because now he's kind of got a wrinkled face looking thing, and he's different. But anyways, I was saying there's a cultural divide between like people who look and sound British now, where people we're already getting into the like people watching the chicken fights being like, this guy talks funny, which is fascinating, like how the sort of American identity is warping in a lot of weird ways. But he is this newcomer who has a wonderful fighting chicken, and he threatens George. Well, Tom Moore threatens George with a sort of a devil's bargain, which is if you can guarantee, like they're winning, they're winning a lot of fights because they train their chickens well and it's going great. And he says, if you can ensure that the speckled red chicken wins the next fight, I'm going to set you free, which for Tom Moore is nothing. He has literally nothing to lose in this bet. It's that George has everything to lose. So he's kind of putting his enslaved person on the line and saying, I don't know, you want to be free? Sure, go for it. And he's not actually going to do it, even if George wins. But what do you do as George in that moment other than say okay and hope to God that this chicken is going to win?
Right.
Yeah,
because we later on, George. So what ends up happening is the chicken loses.
Yeah, I was gonna say just them showing. They do show most of the chicken fight. They just don't show the ending because it's where he would presumably be gored. So they don't show any of that. They just show everyone reacting, and then you watch George's heart fall out of his body.
Yeah, and Tom Moore he's so slimy and untrustworthy because he makes this promise to George where he's like, okay, I'll set you free if you win.
He doubles the bet.
Yep. George loses, and then he's like, well, I really owe that British guy a lot of money.
I don't have that money.
I'm going to have to send you to work. And I think he says, like, you'll just be there for 3 years or something.
Yeah, he says just a couple, and then later they confirm it's 3, and then he's there for way longer. Yeah,
it's like 14 that he ends up being there. And then he's like, but don't worry, once you get back, I will set you free. Like, here are the papers, look. And I'll make sure that I keep your family together. I'm not going to sell them anywhere. And then later, he's like, hey, to his wife, he's like, oh, I'm going to have to sell every single enslaved person except for Kizzy. And his wife is like, well, you told George that you wouldn't. What are you going to say to George? And he says, he won't come back white, my dear. He'll still come back. And he says the N-word.
N-word is always an N-word, right?
And really, what's an N-word to do?
Right. So I don't care.
Yeah. And then we learn in the second half of the episode, when George goes and reunites with his family, he's like, hey, I am free now. When I showed back up, Tom Moore tried to be like, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't remember agreeing to that. Mm-hmm. But then he eventually agreed. So you just can't trust a single thing that Tom Moore says or does.
Yeah, they've really addressed the full spectrum of not the whole spectrum, but a lot of the spectrum of evil that is inherent in this society. And I think that's one of the greatest successes of Roots is that it really explores that this is not as simple as people in bad faith acting as part of a society. It's like people literally can't even conceive of being kind and will not even consider what that is. I think there's also something interesting about now that there is talk of people being free and what it means to free an enslaved person, how many times we see people mention the term papers and I have papers. I can promise you with this piece of paper that your life will be yours if you do XYZ for me. And later on with Tom's story, you don't even need papers anymore because that you now legally are free. Mm-hmm. And just how kind of, I guess, transient that is, how flimsy that idea is.
And what it carries with it is the idea that hey, if you go out into the world, it's going to be assumed that you are not free.
Yes.
So you need these legal papers that say, actually, yes, I am.
Which has been happening since Kunta Kinte, right? Where it's you can't ride a horse. You can't ride a horse by yourself or with Fiddler without papers, that kind of thing. Yeah,
but it's getting even more intense because this part of the story is in the 1840s, but by the time we get to the 1850s, in 1850, following the Mexican-American War, there's a series of compromises that have to be struck as part of this big compromise called the Compromise of 1850 between the North and the South over this new territory and all these other issues with relation to slavery. And one of the concessions made by free states and those who supported abolition, as well as those who didn't want slavery to expand but weren't abolitionists. But one of the things they conceded to pro-slavery states was something called the Fugitive Slave
Mhm.
Act, which essentially bolstered the power of the federal government to find and return enslaved people to wherever they happen to come from, and legally speaking. And one of the things in the Fugitive Slave Act was this this section of it that essentially said the word of a black person could not be used as evidence in court.
Right.
So what ended up happening is people who were like federal slave catchers could see an African American person walking around in the world and just capture them, and then a white slave owner could say like, oh, that person, I own that person. And no matter what the black person said, their own testimony wasn't admissible evidence in court. So that white person could be lying and saying like, oh, that person, I own them, even if they were a free person.
Or if they were someone else's.
Right. If they ran away from a different plantation or whatever. So we're in a period of American history where the efforts of slave owners to like tighten their control on enslaved people is continuing to grow, and the legal system is continuing to support that at the expense of the humanity and the civil rights of African American people. Because it's not too long after that that we get the Dred Scott decision, which says that even if an enslaved person is brought to free territory, it doesn't automatically free them. And it also says that African American people can never be citizens and all sorts of different things. So those, I also was thinking about the papers as a sort of interesting relic of the second-class citizenship or second-class personhood that was foisted upon African American people because of the different legal protections and legal powers that slaveholders and pro-slavery advocates held during this time.
Yeah, exactly. It's the papers thing. I just think the fact that it keeps recurring is like this idea that, and I kind of applaud and kind of am frustrated with this back end of Roots for addressing this idea that like we now have we're developing a structure to give these people a form of freedom, but it's not the freedom that they've been fighting for necessarily. And what I really want, and this is why I'm so curious, part of why I'm so curious about checking out the next generations and like whatever else comes after this and reading more on my own time, is like, what did the shape of freedom start to look like as it became less, it was less like you have free papers that say you're free and you're legally free now, and more just because you're free doesn't mean you're like, just because you're legally free doesn't actually mean anything tangible. And I think that ends up being the core of what the Tom story is about. But just right before we kind of shift there, because we're getting close to the time jump, we do have a really brief but very, very sad scene where, George says goodbye to his family. He once again recounts the story of Kunta Kinte to his children. Very good that they keep bringing that back. They tell it like 3 or 4 times in these 2 episodes. And once he leaves, presumably like a day or so later, a carriage pulls up to the plantation, and the horse, the person pulling the horse says, can you get my master some water? And Kizzy, now in her very old age, goes to the well, gets the woman some water, and recognizes that it's old. It's Missy Ann, aged up with some very bad aging makeup.
Yeah.
Who just happens to be Mac. And the true heartbreak, whether or not this is true or not, is that she claims to not remember Kizzy. Is that dementia? Is that cruelty? And the fact that just because on Kizzy's side, Missy Ann was her best friend, most important person to her, but in reality she was just another one of them, is what she has to kind of reckon now at this like late stage of life, that she can't even have closure with the one person she thought she could trust. She's going to die fully aware that this person never like remembered or cared about her. I
think Missy Ann is lying in that scene.
There's a lot of lingering looks on her, right? Yeah,
the way that she plays it really seems like she's lying.
Which is more sad, right? She's like, no, I don't know you. Didn't know you. It's
just... I think it's a sort of final act of cruelty that just sort of closes out all the acts of cruelty that she's made up to this point, and further cements Kizzy's belief that like there's no such thing as a white person that you can trust
Right.
in this system. You can't even trust Missy Ann to be like, hey, Kizzy, good to see ya. Yeah,
Anyways,
sorry.
bye. Or yeah, I'm sorry. None of that. No.
Nothing at all.
I would love another, if she had lived longer, to have met old George and just be like, guys, don't even think about this. Like, don't even,
Right.
what are you doing?
Yeah.
But yep, so he leaves and he comes back. Chicken George returns to the plantation on April 2nd, 1861. And he bumps into, I believe I had her name. It starts with an L. Irene.
Irene, yep.
Who is Tom's betrothed girlfriend, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, Tom is the oldest son of
George.
George and Matilda.
Matilda, yep. And he meets her, and she says, "Oh, Tom's over there." And it's a very touching moment where, you know, Tom is working on horseshoes. He's a blacksmith and makes horseshoes for horses. And, you know, she says, "Oh, there's a guy here who wants horseshoes," and he says he can damn wait. And she says, "No, I don't think he's that patient." And he turns around and immediately recognizes him, which I found I don't know. Is it surprising? It's been a long time, and he was very young, but he also saw his dad.
He looks the same, and also his dad is wearing his like costume.
His like iconic green scarf. That's true.
Yeah.
It's just that when I think about like who I knew at 10 years old, I thought about meeting them again at like 18 or 19, however old George is here. I kind of like feel like I doubt how much I'd recognize them, because I've met like people who my parents are like, "Oh, this kid would come and visit you when you were younger," but that's not my parents, you know?
Sure, it being a parent is a much different thing.
True. And they have a nice moment, and I love the visual contrast here. We don't talk a lot about the cinematography of Roots, but the choice to put George in this like full bright green and red finery as the plantation, the Moore plantation has gone more and more destitute and more gray and brown and sad is...
Yeah, and we're not at the Moore homestead anymore. We're at the Harvey
true.
plantation.
True.
Yeah.
But yeah, just the like, this guy is no longer from here. For a moment, I actually thought his accent sounded different, and I was like, did they teach like, because he's been in England for a while, and I was like, did they like teach him British English or something? I guess you start to pick up on that a little bit.
I think that was just Ben Vereen trying to be old.
Yeah,
and it came across as British a little bit. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the wacky thing, this is like briefly touched upon. I almost feel like it doesn't get as much time as it could, but the story at this point is trying to shift to Tom's story, and the handoff is a little awkward because what Chicken George's last moments here is the Mr. Harvey talks to him and says, "Oh, you're a free man?" He's like, "Yep, I got papers." He's like, "Well, cool, you can work for me." It's like, I can't even he's like, I can't even fathom what talking to a black person is like that doesn't work for me. Like, I don't even know what you do.
Yeah.
Do you have a place you go to? Do you like, no, you want to work for me? I can pay you. And it's kind of cool too how like a bit of a township has formed up around the homestead and all of that stuff. But we still see as George walks with Tom into the store that like Tom has to ask to go places and has to ask to like go up to the water that he fills for this man. Is this Mr. Brent? I believe it is.
Yeah, they're the Brent brothers. So there's
the Brent bros.
I don't remember what the other one's name is, but there's Evan Brent, who carries on into the next episode.
Jimmy Brent.
And then Jimmy Brent, who ends up dead by the end of this episode.
Right.
Evan Brent is played by Lloyd Bridges. Who was a very liked TV star and is also the father of Bo and Jeff Bridges.
I saw Matt Zoller wrote a piece about original Roots a couple years ago, saying that he felt that the choice to cast the white actors as like famous people was actually an intentional play to be like, even these like staples of American television are capable of awful things. Which I think
that's the way I'm choosing to.
Yeah, that's the positive read on it, right?
Yeah. And I think he does a really good job, actually, Lloyd Bridges, as this truly detestable villainous guy.
Yeah, and I want to more so in the second episode, like how the slave industry, kind of has transformed, and how it's no longer like assumed that this is the norm and is okay with everyone. It's like, oh, now we have to start doing this indoors, and behind closed doors we can talk about it becomes like, I noticed in my notes that I stopped writing the word slavery and started writing the words white supremacy, because it's the same thing with a different title, right? It's just we're doing the same thing, but now we can't do it legally.
Right.
So they this is a moment I had, right, where he's like, I don't want you to give me the water, I want your dad to give it to me. And then his dad's like, you don't tell me what to do, I'm a free man, here's my papers. I'm thinking, what reason would Mr. Brent have to not rip up those papers and be like, all right, done, you're not free anymore? Like, what would stop that?
That's a good question. I mean, I think he's in a public place. Maybe to a certain extent, he is worried that like he would be punished for doing that in some way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's also like, this is a point in the evolution of white supremacy where, like you were saying, everything is entirely in the open, and white supremacy is carried out pretty broadly through legal means. I don't think any act of cruelty that we've seen carried out by a white person up to this point has been illegal.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't think at this point in his life that Evan Brent would do something that could be considered illegal, because it's very comfortable for him to operate and live within the law and what the law prescribes.
Yeah.
And to sort of just say like, okay, well, you're free. And anyway, he sort of has his moment where he puts George down by saying like, well, don't you know that if you stay in this state for long enough, you'll just be enslaved again. That's how it works in this state. And that, I think, to him feels like this sort of immature victory enough. And he's able to walk away feeling proud without putting himself in danger of some sort of legal repercussions.
Yeah, exactly. But again, like, because power dynamics are shifting now too. It's not just like if I rip up these papers, haha, just kidding. Now you belong to somebody again, or now you're no longer free. It's now we have to work within the system, which is to say, like, yeah, if you don't leave the state within 60 days, then your freedom just vanishes. How do we enforce that? And then it's like, well, it's in your contract, which is the introduction of like institutional racism and so white supremacy. Even as the practice of slavery is starting to fade, it's like, well, we still have we have absolutely several effective ways to enslave people.
Yeah.
And then we have like a really wacky hard cut where this like this garrulous white dude comes out of a door and goes, it's war, we did it, we're finally at war, announcing that the Civil War has formally begun. And all of these Confederates are happy that they have something to fight for, and how they want to fight for what they believe in, which is that slavery is awesome. I think the Civil War is another one of my like American history blind spots, because unfortunately it's like, very violent. Oh, it's about slavery, and then Lincoln said the slaves are free. Like, I feel like I'm still vaguely in that space, even though I know it's much, much more complicated than that. But for the context of this series, it basically means that all of these like terrible white supremacists and slave owners are now working in the military and going off to fight, in addition to continuing to own their slaves proudly and justifying it as sort of like a religious and like birthright to them.
The Civil War is, of all the things that have happened in American history, I think it's the historical battlefield that's like the most visible. I think there are other historical battlefields that are sadly not quite as visible, because white supremacy has like triumphed in those cases. Right. Like, I think an event like Nat Turner's Rebellion, for example, is probably severely undertaught, because you can just sort of like shove it away if you don't want to confront it or talk about it. but it is a pretty important moment that I think is misrepresented a lot. But the Civil War is, I mean, there was a campaign of disinformation and propaganda that followed the Civil War, called the Lost Cause, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where essentially people who wanted to protect the legacy of the Confederacy began to say, like, oh, well, Confederate soldiers were honorable and they were fighting for their homeland, or they were fighting for states' rights, or they were whatever the fuck it is they were saying they were fighting for, and let's change the narrative, and not talk about the fact that it was fought for slavery and for the maintenance of the system of slavery. So it makes sense that you have like a blind spot there, because I think the other side of the coin is the version that we get of it. We both went to public school in a northern state, and it really behooves northern states to tell the story of slavery as like the North won and made things good and it's done, because a lot of the systemic racism that Northerners committed and were party to happened in the subsequent decades. Mm-hmm. And so to sort of say like, well, the Civil War and boom, and then that's it. It's a very neat and tidy story that white suburbanites in, Connecticut and Massachusetts and New Hampshire and wherever else can tell themselves. And then white suburbanites in Virginia or whatever, or Georgia or something, can say like, well, it wasn't about slavery. It was about states' rights. That's why we have a Robert E. Lee statue down the street, because he was a great guy.
Separate from all the, yeah, exactly.
Right.
American history is built on the backs of people who still feel to this day justified. Not built on the backs of, but sort of manipulated the messaging by that.
Yeah.
So we see people now in their Confederate outfits, and George ends up moving away after advice from Matilda, who basically says, it's, I'd rather you come back alive and free than like stay here and not be free. So he leaves once again and promises to come back.
She has a beautiful line where she's like, I'm married to a free man. I'm not gonna lie in bed with someone who's enslaved.
Right.
Ever again.
Don't lose that just for your to be with your family for however many months. We've waited long enough for this.
And I think this is one of my favorite scenes. I don't know. There are a lot of really strong scenes in both these episodes. But when he rides away and Tom goes with him.
Yeah.
And
the second time we've recounted the story of Quentin.
They're parting at dusk, and George is telling his son the story again of his roots. And then Tom cuts him off and finishes the story. I thought it was so, so beautiful. Mm-hmm. And it speaks to what we talked about last week, what the show's about, which is like having an understanding of your heritage, where you come from, who you're connected to, is what's going to set you free.
Exactly. And keep that story going. And it's like so, it's one of the most beautiful things about Roots as a series is that you get to watch that legacy directly move over. Like even by the end, they're recounting all the words of the Mandinka tribe and the different words, what they mean and stuff. And it's like they didn't lose it. They actually didn't lose it, because so many people, whether it's because they were enslaved or not, have lost their culture tragically for different reasons. And people should actually, I'm going to hype up the second half of the podcast, stick around for the Chatsum segment, because I want to kind of highlight my attempt to find my own roots in the past week. But definitely there's a lot of like, oops, this was lost to the horrible things. We'll talk. But we move on here, and George is now, for now, out of the narrative. And the funny thing, I think it's actually funny, but it's very sad that it feels like it's 5 minutes later that Tom goes to a farm to get some food. And it's like, bye, Dad, I love you. Like, I'm never going to forget where you came from. Wait, what's this kid stealing my food? And this, like, white boy runs through the barn, like, steals a bunch of bags. And then Tom stops him and, like, has the bags in his hand. The sheriff and Brent and other people come into the barn and say, what happened to the food? He says, like, a white boy stole it. And then they're like, cool, you're holding the bags though, and do we not feed you enough? Of course he's assaulted and punched repeatedly and has his ribs cracked, and it's horrible. I think this is like another one of those, like, even though Roots is one of the biggest criticisms of it is that it is just almost entirely about the violence perpetuated. We don't actually see, well, we see plenty of physical violence, but this is just one of those, like, yep, you needed to see this happen, and how unfair the society is, even as Tom is like still a young guy and has done nothing wrong here. He just is existing. That's something that's another one of those, like, I see parallels today in the way that, like, that blame is shifted to people who didn't deserve it.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, fascinating power dynamics as we get to the end of the first episode, because the boy comes to Tom's house and asks for food because he's starving and he has his wife outside. And George pretty quickly recognizes him as he's like bent over the table covered in bandages. Mm-hmm. And the control dynamic here is so fascinating because he realizes it was him and he tells the boy not to leave and learns that his name is George Johnson. And he says they give him food because he's like, I just want to eat. And they're very kind. They give him a meal of like some soup or something. And he says, can I get a second portion? And they bring in his wife, Martha, who's pregnant. I immediately was on edge for all of this. I know in your notes you had said like everything with Old George just feels vaguely like wrong. And
yeah, it's really strange.
This is one of those
your thought and then I'll have some questions.
Yeah, but just the whole, like, basically what ends up happening is that it seems they start calling him Old George because they say we have another George and you're younger than him, so wouldn't it be funny if we called you Old George? Ha ha ha. Then it's like, this guy's going to turn. Like, Roots has trained us to believe that anytime a white character is introduced into the narrative, no matter what intent they have, they're going to prove to be primally evil. Because that's the way. And they kind of don't, which I thought was fascinating. Not with Old George. I mean, he does terrible things, but he ends the series. I mean, just to jump way ahead, he ends the series kind of on the side of everyone else.
Yeah. Yeah, I was trying to figure out, because we learned that the Ed Asner character last week, 2 weeks ago, was an invention for the miniseries, to basically say to white audiences, like, look, hey, there was a guy at the time who didn't think that the slave trade was good, so that's cool, right?
Yeah.
And so I thought that Old George must have been an invention for the miniseries, but at least from what I was able to find, he is in the book. And I was got this information, I'm ashamed to say, but I'll come clean, from shmoop.com. Because I was just trying to figure out, like, okay, is he in the book? And the Shmoop page makes an interesting point about Old George that I wanted to hear your thoughts on, which is that essentially he's presented to us as like, here's how a white person can be good, right?
Because he grew up so poor and in such terrible situations that nobody around him could ever afford slaves. He couldn't afford to possess other people. So it's like, I never saw it. I don't know what that is.
Right. He says he's from a town that's full of poor white folks just like him. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that this page said is he doesn't care about being like the rich white people. Like, he doesn't want that either. So he because, and this is sort of, I'm adding this analysis now, Tom Moore at the very beginning of the episode, when those white guys on the horses come looking for Nat Turner, and they talk down to him and call him a cracker.
Yeah.
He sort of has this moment of feeling his class to a certain extent, because those are these like aristocratic guys, and also the British cockfighting guy is like, oh my goodness, this is so not the way cockfighting is supposed to be. Oh my God. But so Tom Moore definitely feels looked down upon by more wealthy white people. And so enslaving people and holding on so tightly to owning George, no matter what, indicates this desire to like feel better than somebody else, and essentially guarantee that, like, even if I'm poorer than those other white guys, I am better than black people because of the state of second-class citizenship and slavery that they're being kept in. And in a way, this is back to what the Schmoop page is saying, that is a sort of form of jealousy. Like, engaging in slavery for more is him being jealous of what richer white people have. And the page is saying that old George is like not a jealous person. He isn't covetous of what rich white plantation owners have. And so he's not corrupted by that.
Right. I mean, the kid is basically handed the job of like, oh, everybody else here, has to work for us and we own them. And you're just a harmless kid. You don't deserve to work outside like that. Do you want a job? Here, let me throw you a job, which is very, very real. And he ends up just getting assigned the role of overseer. And what's like, again, the dynamics here, I'm just not informed enough here, listener, to tell you how fraught this is and where exactly this feels wrong. But I'm telling you in my heart of hearts, it's buck wild that he's like, I'm the overseer. And he goes, wait, what does that mean? What do they do? And it's up to Lewis and Tom to be like, well, you have to whip us. And this scene where they call him, quote, the most ignorant white boy I ever did see. And it's like, it kind of reminds me of how Davies was like, wait, they put people in the ships? And it's like, wait, I guess you can understand that like poverty can really like leave you bereft of any education and understanding of the world outside of your area so much that you don't even have a concept of what's going on in another state. Because like everybody on the show talks about, like, I've never seen the world outside of this plantation. So if we're trying to be equivalent here, old George has never seen overseers. I guess I can believe that.
I think that's plausible. I think it's a little, he's sort of painted as like a very
he's
innocent, childlike character. Yeah. In a way that I agree with you that it also felt strange. I think for me, it wasn't so much that I didn't believe that a person could be like this.
More like, why choose to focus on this?
Yeah, right. Exactly. Why is this character here? What are you trying to say with this character? It feels to a certain extent like it's instructive to white audience members to say, like, this is what it looks like to be an ally, I guess. Which I don't think is the exact right word to apply to what old George is. Yeah. But he's deferential to Tom and to Lewis to the extent that like he's doing what they tell him to do, right? He's playing the part of the overseer in the way that they're telling him to do it, because the pragmatism of it is we can either tell this guy what to do, or he could be replaced by somebody who quote unquote knows what to do,
right? Who likes the job
and likes and wants the job, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that is partly what feels really gross about it, is just that the naked pragmatism of that, and then also this sort of idyllic, like this uncorruptible babe of a guy who,
and his wonderful wife who didn't deserve any harm, and they're going to teach the future generations how to be good people too. They're kind of the most difficult concept to parse in this last episode, or that we're going to get into. But
I don't know if that's just us being cynical, or if it really is like unlikely that something like this would have happened.
No, I'm sure stuff like this happened. It's partly the choice to focus on this in the series that's already like focusing on so many things, and also we want, in some ways, if you're going to do the like serious and realistic story about a family that were enslaved, I want to see reality. I don't want to see a like Hollywood nice version of that makes me feel good about being a white person. I don't come to this for that stuff. So that's why I was just like, oh, this old George stuff like feels weird, and like Lewis and him like being like, here's how you whip somebody, and please stop calling. Don't call me sir. Call me the N-word when you're around other people, because that's what I need to be called. Is just so Oh, it's so difficult. I can't. I feel like I look at this and I'm like, what do I even write in my notes? Like, what do I say about this other than this is weird? This is really weird. It's kind of funny
Yeah.
the way
right.
that they're like, taking on the language of like older slaves.
It's almost slapstick.
Exactly.
this
Exactly.
scene. Yeah. But it completely puts agency in the hands of Tom and Lewis.
True.
And
But
they're
you
sort
want-
of doing their parody of the relationship between an overseer and an enslaved person,
Maybe this is a bigger point than we have time to discuss, but it kind of makes me think about like, is there value? Because we talk a lot about in modern media about how like characters, like people of color and women and whatever, and all these like minority folks need to be given agency in stories. Like that's like the most important thing in the representation discussion. But like, if they don't have it and you're trying to tell a story about them not having it, does giving it to them temporarily, like, is that what you want? Like, do I want to watch, the really fraught concept that I've seen thrown around is like, what if I told a story where a bunch of black folks owned white slaves? And it's like, I don't want that because that's not true. It's even like getting to like the Hamilton debate of like, if we portray them as people of color and give them the agency, is that the revisionist history that we want? Or do we want to tell the truth of the matter, which is that there probably were very, 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 very few people like Old George and his wife?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question I ask myself constantly, teaching U.S. history, especially as a white person, teaching predominantly students of color. This question of like, to what extent do you portray these stories as stories of people who were powerless and horrible things were done to them versus people who were powerful and the stories are like full of hope and full of like, all the things they were able to accomplish, because both ends of that are deceptive and dishonest to a certain extent. Because you can't tell the story of American history as like, and then this horrible shit happened, and then this, and all of these people were powerless to stop white male supremacy. Because if that's the way you learn the history, then you're like, well, fuck, then nothing is possible.
Right. It's
and nothing's ever going to change or be better. And it erases stories of people who fought against oppression. But then you make a good point of like, especially when we get into the next episode, there's a lot of focus that's paid to a group, a family of enslaved people who then become free people who have, I think, a level of agency that is atypical.
Yes.
Or at least they're able to affect change for themselves in a way that is not the norm for a lot of people who are living within the system of sharecropping. Mm-hmm. And so by telling a story that is, to a certain extent, and I don't know the numbers on this, but my suspicion is we're telling a story that is to a certain extent special in some way. Does that serve to be like inspiring, or does that serve to be misleading and give us an inaccurate understanding of the lived experience of the average person during this period of time?
Right. Like, what do you want going into Roots? Do you want to see nice white people? I'm sure there's plenty of people in the 70s especially who wanted to see that. It's like, oh, okay, this makes me feel a lot more comfortable and at ease with American history. Do you want to see a brutally realistic picture because that's what 2016 Roots supposedly gives you? And then that's like, well, it sucks, and now I'm sad about the world because nothing has changed really.
Because you have to imagine that Old George, even if there were Old Georges, someone like Old George must have been one in however many people, one in 1,000, one in 100,000, one in a million. I don't know.
Yeah. There could not have been. There's just not. It doesn't make a lot of sense for there to be more than a couple of the Old George type in the world, at the time. And
it's really heartwarming to see, but that also feels kind of dangerous, which I think is what maybe we're feeling. Is you see that scene where Lewis and Tom are teaching him to be an overseer, and you're like, oh, I like this. Wait, this is making me uncomfortable, that I'm like getting comfortable watching Roots.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But in terms of this episode, we have a really brief scene that I don't want to dwell on for too long, where just to establish that I guess the family is really kind and willing to take in Martha and Old George. Martha's child she has a miscarriage, and
Mhm.
Matilda, or no, rather, Tom's wife comes out and basically says, "Your wife is going to be okay." It's kind of a dark parallel to the first scene of the series where Omaro
Yeah.
like comes in and
Yeah.
says, "Oh my God, I'm so happy that there's a child. Like, we're gonna raise him as well as we can." And they don't have the opportunity to do that. So she says, "Your wife is okay," and he says, "But I didn't hear a baby crying." And she's like, "I know that." And then we cut to a sort of funeral of sorts for their unborn child, and everyone is like crying for them and mourning with them. So it's more like these people genuinely like feel a familial bond with old George and Martha. It's not like
Well,
it's
and I think importantly, if to be sort of cynical for a second, it becomes important that old George and Martha feel a familial bond to them as
yes,
well,
yes,
because this is a really pivotal moment where old George and Martha are choosing for these enslaved people to be their family.
yeah,
Um, Whereas if their child had been born, I I mean, to speculate for a second, it's possible that then the demands of like wanting what's best for my kid, quote unquote,
yeah. I guess we can just leave, or we need to.
yeah, may have driven old George to make certain decisions that favored himself and his family
Yeah,
over these enslaved people. And uh, I don't know, like maybe that's out of turn for me to suggest that, but you think about like something like school segregation, even in the modern day,
right.
where like uh, the sort of racism of there being racial disparities in the suburbs or in education, it's driven by like white parents saying, "I want what's best for my kids," at the expense of black kids,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
So that was something that I was thinking about in that scene. That like, it's obviously it's tragic that this child dies, but also it's a really important moment where George and Martha decide like, okay, this is our family, where they might not have necessarily decided to do that otherwise.
Exactly. And I think it's a fascinating relationship that they're choosing to portray. And as we approach this last big moment of the episode, um, I was a little bit unclear here on what leads Tom's wife to come to the barn, but basically, one of the Brent brothers, Jimmy Brent, gets her to come alone at night. And he basically has this conversation with Tom that I wanted to ask you about the substance of. That basically involves
Yeah.
a scene where he says like, one of us has to like extend a branch at some point. We can't just hate each other forever. Like,
Hmm.
you know, um,
So, in the sense that I get is that he's trying to desert the Confederate Army
okay,
because the Confederacy is losing the war. And he's sort of saying, like, we're definitely going to lose. We've been beaten by the Union. I got to get out of there. You got to help me.
yeah,
And Tom decides, okay, I'll help you. So he hides him out in the barn.
yeah,
And then I think it's a coincidence that Irene is like going to the barn for some other reason
yes, that's what it is.
and he's there.
Right. And in that moment, though, like I said, he has this part with Tom where he's like, we can keep fighting forever, but eventually, like, it seems like pretty soon you're going to be declared free. Like, we don't have to keep fighting. We could just be friends. And Tom takes him on faith. Unfortunately, takes him on faith. It sucks. And he trusts him, and he attempts to rape Irene. Tom gets incredibly angry. I love George Sanford Brown's performance here. But this scene especially sold it for me, where I was just
He's
like,
really good throughout the whole thing.
he just feels like one of the most realistic members of the like Kunta Kinte legacy, because he has like a deep, profound anger and frustration within, but still desperately wants to like care and be a family man.
Yeah,
and
he wants for people to be good. He wants for the world to be a good place. He's not naive the way that Chicken George is, which I think is sort of his flaw, is that he's like, oh, Tom Moore's my friend. And he sort of is learning from both Kizzy and from George, in the sense that he has Kizzy's rage, And he has George's sort of like upbeat hope that maybe the world can actually be a good place. And I think seeing his father free, seeing old George being a good person to him, gives him faith that like maybe the world can be a better place than what it is. So it is really upsetting to see, okay, but this Brent guy is a villain. He's just a bad person.
Right. And yeah, this is a moment where I was like, please, like, let's allow violence to happen here as a justification for cruelty. And I mean, it does. Tom fights with Mr. Brent and then drowns him in the trough nearby or whatever. And immediately is like, oh, well, now I have to live with that. And that's sort of the suspense that we leave with him for now. And then the next day, the other Brent brother has been looking with the rest of his Confederate men for his brother for several days now, and is specifically looking for the guy who killed him. All of the enslaved folk come outside of the barn and say, we don't know who did it. We don't know who did it. None of them are going to snitch, obviously. And he notices that Tom has some lumps on the side of his cheek, and they have this like very well written moment where they kind of are both speaking in innuendo about like, you know, people need to be punished for when they do bad things. Tom saying like, yeah, sometimes people deserve what comes to them. Mr. Brent and just kind of like without being explicit are both saying like, I know what you did, you know what I did. Word, and he says, you know, I'm gonna come back for you someday. So I was expecting him to just get straight murdered next episode, but it's more complicated than that. So that was a lot. That was about as long as the episode was. But it's a really, I thought this was one of the best episodes of the series so far. I think, yeah, just the handoff from Chicken George into Tom's story, while a little bit awkward, is like necessary. And I'm getting a lot out of Tom's story and where like his relationship to both the people that he works with, and also like what does freedom start to look like after the Emancipation Proclamation, which comes about in the final episode. So, John, do you have any other stray notes here?
No, I don't think so. A lot of the stuff that I'm eager to talk about happens in the second episode.
For sure. So let's take it to a brief musical break, and we will be back to discuss the final episode of Roots.
Welcome back to RootsChatz. The second episode we watched this week was part 6 of the 1977 original series, Roots. It was written for TV by James Lee and William Blinn, directed by Marvin J. Chomsky. It originally aired on January 29th and 30th of 1977. And Alan, let us know what happened in this episode of Roots.
In this episode, the final episode of Roots, the Civil War is over. But night riders terrorize ex-slaves. By marking his client's horseshoes, Tom identifies the raiders, and endangers his own life. Chicken George, who fought for the Union, rejoins his family. He leads them to a new home in Tennessee. So, Magellan, I want to ask you something.
Okay.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good.
This episode, it seems like we kind of push the struggle to a certain point, and the series has to end. And it feels like it's an interesting choice that it ends after the Emancipation Proclamation, and suggests in these last moments that everything is going to be okay. And I'm wondering how you feel about that in a show that has otherwise like very explicitly said that the slave trade is institutional and didn't go away with the Emancipation Proclamation. How do we get to this point that's like happy? Is that because it's a good, just being a show, or like what's going on?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts there. For just to be the technical historian guy for a second, they actually don't address the Emancipation Proclamation in this show at all, which is interesting.
Oh, that's true. I'm sorry.
Because that happens in 1863,
Mm-hmm.
if my memory serves me.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a measure. I mean, if people are, I know we have a lot of listeners who aren't American, and so I don't know to what extent this is the myth that people know or not, but sometimes people say that Lincoln freed the slaves, quote unquote, which is not accurate. Lincoln did sign and issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared enslaved people free in the territories that were in rebellion against the Union, as a military measure that was inspired by the actions taken by enslaved people to free themselves during the Civil War. And so Lincoln and his generals saw it as advantageous to say, like, okay, let's ride this wave of people who are freeing themselves in the chaos of the war, to say, like, come join the Union Army so that we have more soldiers to fight against the Confederacy. This episode opens in 1865, which is the year that the 13th Amendment is passed and then later ratified as part of the Constitution. So the history is a little interesting, and kind of it's made very neat and like sped up, I think, in this episode, because it starts where someone's like, hey, the war's over, and then immediately Lewis maybe is running home from hearing that announcement.
Yeah, it's Lewis.
And he says, the war's over, we're free.
Yeah.
And it just wouldn't have been quite that quick and straightforward at the time, I don't think, because it was common knowledge at this point in the Civil War that the war was being fought over slavery. And that a northern victory would come with emancipation. That at least seemed to be where things were going. But that wouldn't necessarily become a legal reality until the passage of the 13th Amendment, which happens at the beginning of 1865, that Congress passes it. And then it becomes a condition of the southern states' readmittance into the Union that they accept the 13th Amendment and like vote to ratify it, basically. Mm-hmm. So the timeline, I think, would have been a little more complicated, with white people like suppressing the knowledge that the war was over, suppressing the fact that the 13th Amendment had been passed, and there would have been more of a struggle, I think, than what we see happening, where the character of Mr. Harvey, I don't remember his first name, but the guy who owns the plantation, basically shows up and he's like, hey, so we probably all heard that freedom is happening, and now you can stay, but I think maybe you could crop a share. It's like, really, there's a lot of stuff in this episode that's kind of hokey and like on the nose. And that's one of those moments where he's like, what if you farmed a share of the crops?
It's very 101.
Yeah.
Hey kids, this was a practice that they did back in the day.
But sorry, go ahead.
It's called sharecropping, and it's another form of slavery.
Yeah, I think it to answer, coming out of that now long historical tangent, to answer the question you were asking, I think this episode kind of is lukewarm on the way in which it addresses these sorts of modern forms of white supremacy and these descendant institutions of slavery, because it portrays them and sort of pays lip service to what's going on, but then, like you said, ultimately ends in a hopeful place of like, but we were able to get away and start our own farm, and now we don't have to worry about those problems anymore. And so it ends up making sharecropping feel like this epilogue to slavery, that's like, yeah, and that didn't stick around for very long because now we're all free and it's fine. As opposed to addressing the fact, like you're saying, that really, if you were a person who was enslaved in the South and then you become a sharecropper, how many sort of tangible differences are there in your life from 1861 to 1871?
And to be fair, this take of ours here about like sharecropping is slavery by a different name is extremely not. We're not the first people to think about that or to
Yeah.
let this. I mean, even just googling the term sharecropping, you get like multiple YouTube videos called it's slavery with another name. Like, you know, that's commonly understood nowadays, but at the time, yeah, I think one of the best things about this episode, amongst all of its like weird flaws, is that they understand that just because quote unquote slaves were freed, it doesn't mean a whole lot when like freedom looks the exact same, acts the same, works the same, and now it just has a more capitalist bent to it.
Yeah, I think you know, I'm curious for us to, and we can kind of show our cards, but I think we've decided that we're going to watch Roots: The Next Generations. And the reason that I'm interested in watching that is because this episode really is, I think, falling into the kind of convenient narrative that like, oh, slavery and oppression ended with the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
And then, you know, it's like, and then skip a few years, and then the Civil Rights Movement happened in the 60s, and it was great. And it's like, well, what are all of the institutions and systems and actions taken by white supremacists that necessitated a civil rights movement in that 100-year span? In the popular imagination, I think those things are glossed over and not described and rendered to the extent that they need to be.
Precisely why I want to watch Next Generations, by the way.
Yeah, and so it sort of gets to the question we were asking in the first half of like, emancipation is a hopeful moment.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
But also, the struggle is not over. And so how do you depict that? Because you want to be able to end your miniseries Roots on this sort of upbeat thing of like, look, you know, we connected with our roots and our roots brought us to freedom. And it's what the show and the book are trying to communicate. That like, if you hold on to this African lineage, if you hold on to this truth about who you are and hold on to the community around you, then it will deliver you to freedom. Mm-hmm. That's like the thesis of the show. And so, you know, it needs to arrive at that point by the end. But like the 1870s is not the end of these oppressive systems. And so that's the difficulty I have with this episode overall.
100%. Yeah. But the ABC of them getting there, I think, is very enlightening. I mean, right away, after everybody's talking about sharecropping, and they're like, we don't know if we, like, one of the core conflicts that Tom's family has to deal with in this episode is like, do we leave and start over with nothing as free people, or do we stay and make our money here and try to like carve out our own existence by choice as sharecroppers? And then we get to the shop, which is another one of the better sets in this series, where a black man comes up to the counter that Brent works at the shop now, and like asks for bread and some, I think, grits, and another man walks in front of him, and he gets to say, finally, he has this like pretty triumphant moment of, you know, I was here first. I'm a customer just like you're a customer. We all get to participate in the market economy, right? And the guy, and Brent takes his money, and then like it's an 80s like He-Man episode, the camera, once the man leaves, pans to the left, and there's this like evil British man who's like, oh man, you know, Brent goes up to him and goes, oh my god, I missed you. Or he comes up to him and he's like, I missed you. Like, did you see that? They have rights now. Isn't that wild? He's like, yeah, but like, come on, like we can still be white supremacists as much as we want, right? Like they can still work for us. I've got plans. I'm a senator. Yeah. And it really like hammers in when you realize like they don't say it enough, but this guy has a position of power. Like this guy works in the state, you know, or works for as a senator he has enough money and enough
Yeah.
clout that his like decisions matter and affect this community in major ways. And the fact that he's still on the side of like we should maintain the structure of slavery is basically damning entirely for these characters and their families.
Yeah. Just to go back for a second to that moment, I think it's a really tough moment where the family learns that they're free effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And Tom and Lewis really represent two sides of the argument here, and they represent two sides of another argument later. I think that the Tom and Lewis dynamic is pretty well portrayed. I
agree.
And they represent, I think overall something that Roots does effectively is it like frequently has black characters talking to each other about like questions that don't have clear answers.
Right, whereas the beginning of Roots is kind of like Kunta Kinte is the only person who's thinking about freedom. That's one of the problems of it. It's like now we have multiple people who are in power and have agency who are disagreeing with each other, even though they are all black and they all like come from the same place. They can still address freedom and what that means in different ways.
Yeah, and that moment where Lewis is saying like, well, we're free. Like, what is freedom if you just stay in the same place? And Tom doesn't say this explicitly, but he's basically like, well, what is freedom if you
have to leave?
If you have to leave, or what is freedom if you like don't have the means to survive and you starve or you just can't make it? Like, we have something here where we are, we know how to do this, we know how to farm, we know that this is going to make us a certain amount of money. We can start our freedom here. He says like this is as good a place as any.
Mm-hmm.
And that scene really, I think you need go no further than that to make a case for the necessity of reparations in this country. And there are plenty of other previous historical reasons and forthcoming historical reasons why reparations for African Americans are vital to true equity in our society. But you just think about that moment, like freedom didn't come with any of the infrastructure necessary to make it so that people could live truly free lives. Because what are your options? Your options are like, go out on the road and go somewhere you've never been before to find something you don't even know what it could look like or what it could be, or stay exactly where you are and do the things that you've been doing because you know that you can survive by doing that. So yeah, that scene was really powerful for me because it embodies this question of like, what is freedom? And in this moment where African American people are told that they're free, substantively speaking, are they? And what are the kind of, in a capitalist society, what are the material necessities that someone would need to have in order to truly be free? And like, can an oppressed people be free under capitalism and all this other stuff? But I think those are important questions that the show poses and engages with, but then ultimately seems to find like a convenient answer to.
Yes, because what they end up doing is what you did just describe, which is packing up and going somewhere else.
Yeah.
But the other thing I'm thinking about is like when you say what is the end of slavery, quote unquote, the end of slavery look like? What does that tangibly mean? I mean, unfortunately, like you just follow the internal logic of it. If Brent, for example, refused service to the man asking for bread, in theory, what would happen to him? Well, the police would come for him. Well, the sheriff wants this to happen and is part of a white supremacist organization. Why, or like is not in support of like getting rid of it, I guess.
Yeah, he's sympathetic to it.
So what's the worst that would happen to him? He would get a slap on the wrist and move on, but he refused service to a person because of their race. Like they really did just like put a new coat of paint on the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
then eventually that becomes codified.
Yes,
like
yes.
Providing different levels of service to different people becomes codified in Jim Crow laws.
Right.
Yeah.
So they start talking about, like, we can finally compete now that we can earn money. We can do what everybody else does and earn a fair living, and like start a family and like raise our family really well and live happily. And I mean, there is something, and this is just coming from the leftist in me, that's like depressing about their victory being that they get to compete now in the capitalist structure. Like that was the end game all along, was like, and now we finally, which is kind of where we're at now, where it's like, great, now you get to fight in the same fight that we do, but you just have to start at a disadvantage that you can never get over.
Yeah, and it definitely feels Tom's outlook in this scene. It's not a 1-to-1 comparison between like the disagreement between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, but it feels similar in the sense that in like the 18, I'm trying to remember the exact year,
18
but
Schmump
like
things.
18 Schmump things, like the late 1800s. 70s, 80s, 90s, somewhere in there. Booker T. Washington rises to prominence as this guy who is advocating that what formerly enslaved people need to do, what free black people need to do, is they need to forget about these sort of debates about civil rights or equality and basically just buy into the sort of rags to riches story. That like, if you learn a trade, if you work, if you devote yourself to economic stability, then those other things will follow. And that's just such a, I think, dangerous ideology that different groups of people throughout American history become convinced of, that like, if, this system is fair, it is possible to work yourself up from poverty or whatever, and then everything will be hunky-dory and you'll get respect, and it just doesn't work that way. And the W.E.B. Du Bois response to Washington is essentially like, no, that doesn't work. We need to demand rights, we need to demand equality, we need to fight for those things. Because they're not just going to be handed to us because we like played by the rules for long enough. So you can really see throughout this episode how Tom is like very eager to see a world that works by the rules, and over again, he faces repercussions, I suppose, for hoping that the world is a better place than it actually is.
Right, and you have to, I think, as somebody like Tom, you have to believe and hold something in your heart that, like, yeah, we can still find a form of freedom in this. You always can. Even as enslaved people, they were still able to have weddings and fall in love and have children. And like, there are little moments of hope and positivity that they're able to have while fighting for a system that actually can become more equitable. It's slow. It's an extraordinarily slow process that, I mean, hasn't ended, but it's seemingly an endless process, but he's acknowledging that and saying like, okay, well, maybe now within my lifetime, instead of the way Kizzy talks about it or the way Kunta Kinte talks about it, where it's like, in my future generation's lifetime, maybe they will be out of this. Maybe they will be able to, because that's like the end of Kunta's story, is him being like, well, it's not me, but it's going to be them that get out. So there's all of that great stuff between the two of them. And we have a brief scene of, like I had mentioned earlier, the sheriff and Brent and some other men kind of going from just slave owners that can talk openly to like being behind closed doors, realizing our way of life is no longer necessarily legal. We have to do this exactly the way we're doing it, but just a little bit quieter. And two of the men attempt to sort of be holier than thou and say, well, we have laws, and the law says what you're doing is illegal, and I respect the law over everything else, which is a very common sort of line of thinking amongst people at this time. It's like, well, the law says it, so I guess we can't do it anymore. Especially by like folks in the North, where it's like, well, we made it illegal, so now it has to be gone, right? That's the line of thinking that puts it into textbooks. That like we got rid of slavery because the law says it's not there anymore. The law is king. But
Yeah.
really, the law is in support of these white supremacists as much as anything else is.
Yeah, and we see this. We enter into this period of time in American history where, and I think what the episode does a good job of portraying, as you're saying, is this transition from white supremacy being enshrined in the law to it being something that is exercised by extra legal means for this stretch of a couple decades. And in that time, the legal foundations of white supremacy are rebuilt.
Right.
So that by the time you get to the 1960s, no longer is it extra legal. I mean, the KKK still exists, but as we heard a clip from John Lewis last week, John Lewis was beaten by police officers, right? So that is a matter of white supremacy once again being enshrined in the legal system. But this stretch of time here in the late 1800s, at least on paper, you have a Southern society that's being told by the victorious Union, these people are free. And they mention it in the episode, but there's a military occupation of the South from 65 to 77, where it's like, okay, you need to respect the freedom of these people, these free men. And if you don't, there are Union soldiers who are going to do something about that.
Right.
Because the faith that Tom has here is, well, we'll talk about it, but he envisions a way for these guys to be punished that goes all the way up to the military people who are overseeing this region, and that's ultimately thwarted through extra legal means. But yeah, I think the episode does a good job of sort of portraying this moment of transition for white supremacy as it becomes, at least temporarily, an extra legal entity, as the legal framework for white supremacy is rebuilt and shifted in the wake of the end of slavery.
Exactly. That's very well said. And like, there are moments in this episode that I think read now as corny, and that's probably because these conversations were really truly happening behind closed doors and just history doesn't talk about them. So for example, the one I think of right here is the British senator talking to Brent and Company, and they basically are like inventing the concept of generational poverty and like the endless grip of capitalism, where they're like, okay, well, so what can we do that won't get us in trouble though? How can we be white supremacists? Well, they want to be sharecroppers. They want to use our tools and use our land and call it their own and earn their own money. Well, all we have to do is say that they actually, in their contract, owed us money for those tools and for that land and for their crops, and then just keep moving. And then like Brent kind of cuts in and goes like, oh, and then we never make it attainable. We'll just keep raising the bar. It's like they're just, it feels so simple the way that they talk about it. But again, I'm sure these conversations did happen. Even though they feel nowadays like they are buried in legalese and stuff, it's like, no, people did probably just say like it would be easier if they could never pay off their debts.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing in that scene of like, did it really happen in quite the straightforward way that that these guys were like, oh, and then we can make their debts higher than the amount that they'd get from their crops.
Perfect.
Yes, of course. Twirl our mustaches.
Twirl the mustache, yeah.
But yeah, it must have happened to a certain extent. And I think also, because obviously it was endemic across the South, this system of sharecropping and tenant farming. So at some point, there were conversations among white landowners of, hey, this is how you should do this. I think the other thing to keep in mind is the context of Roots as a TV show in the media landscape of depictions of slavery and the aftermath of slavery. And I think part of the sort of across the plate simplicity of some of the scenes in this episode are as a form of education for the audience of this show.
Yeah. Right.
Because
you need to understand that this was structural. You, the audience, need to understand that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if kids in the school in the 60s and the 70s, I don't know if they were learning about sharecropping in public schools, you know?
I mean, I know for a fact it was glossed over when I was in school. So like, I'm sure it was worse.
And then major film depictions of the Confederacy, of slavery. You know, what do you have prior to Roots? You have Gone with the Wind.
Yeah.
That depicts the antebellum period as this like idyllic time of, you know, the races in their proper places.
Yeah.
Birth of a Nation is pretty old at this point, but still is a depiction of slavery in the Civil War and Reconstruction that is very present in people's minds. And in fucking Birth of a Nation, the Ku Klux Klan are heroic.
Yeah, they're saving women.
Yeah, they're like setting right Southern society during Reconstruction. So
you start, it's more like it's what we talk about. What we were talking about in the first half about like what does positive portrayal of Black characters in media do for the like general image of them. And in a way, and to be kind of cynical, shows like Good Times and All in the Family having Black characters in their main cast kind of paints that as like, guys, it's fine. Like we fixed this, right? Like we're okay. They get their own shows. Like what else do they want?
We're literally having good times.
They're all having good times, you know.
And I haven't seen Good Times, so maybe it's probably more complex than that. But,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But it's just like instead of talking about like, hey, this is what it looked like, it's like, but look what it looks like right now. I'm reflecting back your world at you, white person who lives in a white neighborhood surrounded by white people. Look, don't you have you're diverse.
Yeah.
It's this like kind of lie given to the American people. And I don't want to just like sound fully cynical, but that's kind of the truth of it.
Yeah. And so there are moments in this episode that I think are like on the nose, but maybe if you're an audience member in the 70s, they're like challenging some fundamental misconceptions that you hold about this period of time. Because there's this moment, and then there's like the moment where later Evan Brent. So basically, what happens is a bunch of these white guys are very angry that formerly enslaved people are free, and so they go around and they're like riding. They're called the Night Riders by people colloquially, and they're burning crops,
burning farms,
burning farms and stuff, and clearly as a way of setting back these free people by eliminating a chance that they have to do the sort of like pick yourself up from your bootstraps thing that we were talking about before. And then Lewis I think it's Lewis who hatches the plan, or it might be Tom. Yeah, Tom and Lewis are talking about it, and Tom is like, I make the horseshoes because I'm the blacksmith. And Tom says, what I can do is when I make the horseshoes and shoe their horses, I can carve unique marks into the horseshoes so that when they come through again, we can see from the tracks who they are, which is like a really interesting, brilliant plan that they hatch. And so what ends up happening is they gather that evidence, take it to the sheriff, and then the sheriff goes to Evan Brent, and he says, hey, I have this evidence against you.
Seems infuriating.
Yeah, I don't want to get you in trouble, so this evidence needs to go away. So you need to make Tom Harvey
go away.
Right. And so it's awful. But it's a really good depiction of how the law is still stacked against Black people at this time.
Yep.
But then the other on the nose moment is after he says that to Evan.
Oh my God.
Brent, he's like holding a pillowcase and turning it over in his hands, and he's like, Meh, and he takes the cigar and burns out eye holes, and he's like, that'll do nice. He doesn't say this, but he's like, Meh, pia, pia. And
the music is kind of sinister, and it's like, oh no, and then the KKK existed.
Right.
Whoa.
And it feels a little hokey. But again, if you're an audience member in the 70s and you haven't and you've hardly seen the KKK depicted on screen,
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's a shocking moment. And maybe that to you is like, oh, okay.
That's how that starts.
I don't know. But maybe also in the 70s, you've lived through the civil rights movement and you've seen the true colors of people associated with the KKK. And
You've seen other members of it, right?
I don't know. It's hard to retrieve the context for that scene, but at least to me,
it just feels hokey.
It feels like, okay, I get it. Like
like the show
so
has,
smart.
and maybe it's our education, but the shows also feel like educated us enough to know that it's like not. I don't know. It's not. They're not like the evil villains of the story. It's like the system is the villain of the story. It's
well,
not
that, and the people who like use the system to their own benefit.
Correct. So he puts on this pillowcase and they go for another big ride. At this point, actually, what I thought was kind of interesting but brief was Mr. Harvey decides to actually leave the farm, and he says, "You guys can have it. I can't afford to stay here anymore." Basically, like I'm not making enough off of it. Which
he sells it to the senator.
Or that's what it is.
Yeah.
But when they leave, Harvey's wife is talking to them, and then I believe it's Tom's wife who calls her master. Or Matilda calls her master one more time. She's like, "Oh, now you chose to say it." It's kind of the moment there.
That scene was odd. Because Harvey,
what do you miss about? Did you miss something about that? Like, what's
it really? I'm not sure what point the show is trying to make with Harvey, because it seems that Harvey is generally depicted as like a fine guy in terms of like interpersonally how he treats the black people who live on his farm, because there's the line where Matilda's like, "You were better than some." That's like her big thing she says to him before he leaves.
Yeah.
So it's like, I don't know what the show is really doing there per se by not depicting him as like inherently cruel, because he also still is very much enslaving people.
Yes.
And in the previous episode, when the Confederate guys come to talk to him, they're like, "Hey, we need help," and he's like, "Of course, I'll give anything to the Confederacy, anything you need. Like, you can have horses and money and stuff, and I'll help you out." So he's kind of a question mark character to me.
Mm-hmm.
But it was definitely an interesting scene where he's leaving and everybody's like, "I'm not saying goodbye to this guy who owned me. No way. I'm not saying goodbye.
No.
Just leave."
Yeah, when they later on, like when they actually leave this place once and for all, they're like, "Aren't you gonna miss it? You've been here for so long." And then it's I think it's Matilda who's like, "Fuck that." Like,
yeah, right.
Don't care. Don't need to be here anymore. Nothing about this place matters. Like, is good to me. Yeah, their relationship to that stuff is kind of where the back end also like puts up some question marks for me.
Because Matilda's like everybody, where are your manners?
Yeah.
And it's like, why? This sucks that there's this sort of obligation for them to be civil to someone who owned them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, we were talking earlier about the senator buys the farm and he comes with Mr. Brent and basically has this awful scene where he assigns everybody their debt and says, now that you guys are going to be sharecropping here, of course you're entitled to the work that you do, but also, someone has to pay for all the stuff that you guys used without paying for it. So it's X amount of money. I'm sure you'll pay it off in several years. Who knows how many? And Tom kind of has this moment where he's like, "I thought they cleared that," and he's like, "Nope, that's not how money works. We decided it doesn't work like that."
Yeah, because it's something that Harvey says verbally. He says, "Hey, I'd like for their debts to be cleared," and the senator's like, "Yeah, totally." They shake hands, but then it's never put in writing anywhere.
Right.
Yeah.
Just he said that doesn't mean anything. And we missed the scene here briefly. I think it's actually crucial because we're talking about Old George, and in one of the scenes of all of the folks inside of one of the barn in the late evening, Lewis is the one who's becoming a little bit more. I don't want to say. I think angry is the closest word I can use here.
Yeah, this is another moment where Lewis and Tom represent diverging points of view
Exactly.
about what exactly is to be done. And Tom's answer is the sort of like, I guess if you want to make another rough comparison to other historical figures, you could sort of see Tom's answer as the kind of like NAACP, like let's take it to court and go through the system kind of response. And Lewis is the more almost like Black Panther response of like,
they're never going to give it to us.
Yeah, you can't trust the legal system. You can't trust the law. The thing that needs to happen is we need to arm ourselves to do something about this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And this manifests itself when they turn and like go, wait a minute. Old George is still here. We don't talk about him because he's been with us for years and we consider him a family member, but he's white. And Lewis turns to him and says, we can't trust this guy. Just because we like him doesn't mean that, like, the changing time is going to attract him because, quote, like attracts like. Like, just he's going to be enticed by the promise of white supremacy, just like everyone else is, and eventually, inevitably turn on us. And also, like you said, makes the point that, like, speaking through the law and to the law is not going to help anyone. It's not going to help anyone at this moment. And there's a moment here too where I was like, I wanted to just yell at Tom because Lewis's point is one that comes up in the news a lot these days, where it's like, how much can we trust the systems of justice in our society anymore when they are built on white supremacy? Do we continue to try to fix them, or do we accept that they need to be re-established, abolished, and rebuilt from the ground up as something else?
Right.
So it's like you're kind of hearing a very modern conversation here about like how much can we take them to court versus like eventually they're gonna get off every single time this needs to be changed structurally.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But old George leaves. He says it's fine, like I'm not actually mad at you guys, but he definitely takes it to heart. And later we see him like sitting with Martha and they're watching a later moment of violence happen. But before that, he is actually offered the position because Brent looks at him when he's telling everybody else about their debt and says, hey, but you're a fine, strapping young white man, and you don't deserve to work hard, backbreaking physical labor like that. That's not fair to you. Do you want to just be overseer? And he re-offers him the overseer job.
Yeah, it's a parallel moment to the previous scene.
Exactly.
In the first episode, yeah.
And I think that's like when we said, what was the purpose of that scene? I think it's to kind of then like fully contrast this and make us very wary of old George and truly believe that he has fully accepted his position and is ready to do that stuff. And so he takes it because of course he does, because he's mad and feels betrayed by the people that he cared about. And then again, we get one of the scariest scenes of this episode where the men ride up to Tom's cabin trying to come for him and threatening him unless he comes outside. At this point, I saw, because there were so many men, I actually thought it was going to go all the way and one of them was going to be old George. But even better is him turning and looking through the window and going, that's happening. Anyways, and at first he doesn't do anything. He's just like, oh, let's wait and see where this is going to go.
Yeah.
So Tom goes outside, has his shirt pulled off, and Evan comes up to him and like it says that you deserve this, and gets ready to whip him. Old George comes outside, and at this point I desperately just wanted it to be like, if we're gonna go for the like white hero story, old George should have just clocked Brent there and ended it. But the truth of the matter is he comes up to him, thinks about doing it, and then they're like, nope, you're gonna die too if you do that, like don't even start. And instead he says, I'm not doing this to save him. Why are you guys trying to hurt him? And he says, well, he's going against the law and he's like telling lies about us. And then he goes, yeah, I guess he does have it coming, but you guys put me in charge here and nobody whips my N-word but me. And, I really did fall for it, where I was just like, okay, yeah, great. So old George is a terrible person and we knew this all along.
Right. Me too.
I think they're successful in that way, and the actor portrays it pretty well. And so he takes the whip. They go, okay, if they're yours, then you do it. And he hits him once or twice, and then Tom passes out and goes fully unconscious. Brent says, you have to keep doing it to him so he remembers it. And then he says, all right, guys, I'll take care of it. You can go. This is my job now. and you start hearing the sound of the whip, and eventually we
Yeah.
turn back, and George has been whipping the floor for a while in just
They do
pure
a
frustration.
really good job with like keeping it right up until the last second, where you're just not sure
Is he
what
doing it or not?
old George has decided to do. Yeah.
And he like cries and runs up to Tom and like says, "Please, please be alive." And they wake him up, and he's fine. And it's weird here where Tom's wife is like, it's like, "You saved my husband." It's like, you just fucking, you did. I mean, you literally did, but
Right.
just like the way that it happened is so scary and sad and frustrating. But he had to play the part.
Right. It's a really complicated scene
Mhm.
that ultimately I think for as much as I felt like I'm not so sure about the character of old George, this scene really, really worked for me.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And now we know that like you have to. It's that, and then Tom, when he's like having his wounds dressed. Excuse me. He was like, "Take my son away. I don't want him to see me like this." Which kind of like is that historical part where, do we tell the story of slavery as it is, and do we show it in violent detail so that people know that it can happen to them? Or do we like let them live in a world where they don't know about it as well? So I'm kind of curious because that's Tom's son, whose name is Bud. I'm curious like if the story chooses to focus on him or one of Tom's other kids, like how that manifests in his memory. But he goes outside, and what we learn is he's seen enough of it, because he sits outside with Martha, old George's wife, and immediately is like, "I'm going to kill those white men." She's like, "Ah." And she kind of plays a really, again, interesting role here, acknowledging her complacency in the system, but also making the kind of, true point, which is like, if you're going to be racist and start killing white people, she doesn't say this, but sort of like the way that Nat Turner did, that means you're hurting innocent people also, including me. And I like you guys, but you're doing it to me too. Like, if you're going to make a wide swath and say that all white people are evil, then you're as bad as them, which I think is pretty problematic. I think is like
super problematic.
A message that this show doesn't need to teach the kids inside of the show or the viewer of the show.
It really felt like it was here's a message to all you black kids out there.
Yeah.
Don't just hate white people, because some of us didn't do anything wrong. And it's like, woof, Roots.
Come on.
Doing. Because they really linger and spend time on this scene, and they also give the scene to two characters that up to this point have said very little.
Exactly.
To the point that I think it's meant to feel like you could be these people.
Right. This is just some other people that existed.
They're almost like anonymous, really,
Mhm.
because they have been given a lot of screen time. And it really bothered me.
I felt gross here. 'Cause she even says like, "We love you just like our own. If you let us love you," which like might as well have been said 100 years earlier. Like that's not progress.
Yeah.
We just like, I'm sure people who owned enslaved people were like, "Yeah, we love you," but
Right.
also do work for us. Like it doesn't mean anything.
It's very, very both sidesy. In a way
Exactly.
that sucks.
It's not on the responsibility of black people to extend the arm, because as we saw literally at the end of last episode, Tom tried that and it went terribly, and tried it in this episode with the police and it went terribly. It has never gone well in this series. So why is the series now telling us like, but progress comes from reaching across the aisle and like understanding that those are people too? Like, no, it doesn't. No, it does not.
It's sort of like, I don't know. It really smacks of white people learning all the wrong lessons from Martin Luther King.
Right.
Of like, oh, if you're just passive and like, don't get too worked up and don't hurt anybody, then everything will be fine. And it's like, that's not really what Martin Luther King was saying.
Right.
That's like a reinterpretation that's convenient and makes white people comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
But it just is, it was really frustrating.
Because from here on, the series like gets a little bit, it kind of gets to just retribution. It becomes about like, okay, how do we wrap this up?
Yeah, it almost does this sort of like adventure, like romp.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yes.
Like the back end of this feels.
This is the last moment where like they are challenging notions. From here on, it's like, and then they can just win without.
Yeah, it's all.
qualms.
I don't know. It's like it feels like I don't know. I don't know. I feel like MASH or something, or Hogan's Heroes. I don't know what any of those shows were about, but it feels very like almost sitcom-y.
Yeah. Because like, they have Brent's gun. I don't know how Brent like left his gun there. I mean, is this the gun from earlier?
It's his brother's gun.
His brother's gun. Okay, that makes sense then.
Yeah.
And somebody's knocking on the door, and they all are like, turn the candles off. I think this is a really scary scene. And then who could it be? It's Chicken George, everyone. He's back. Worth mentioning that there have been multiple scenes that we didn't really talk about where everyone is like, why are we staying here anyways? And they're like, yeah, because Chicken George is coming back. Like, when he comes back, we promised him we would be here. All of his work is in vain if we're not here when he comes back.
Right.
He totally comes back. And he tells this beautiful story about in his older age, he got to fight with the Union, and he learned a lot about military strategy, and he comes out of it like almost enlightened. Where he's like, and then everything went fine, and we did it. We fought a good fight. And it's like kind of glorifying this like, with this war where it's like, and then we did the good work. And now I'm happy to come home to my family and our home that belongs to us. Like, what world are you living in?
Yeah. It was, I mean, it felt good to see.
Of course it does.
George. Yeah, right. But it does feel convenient also.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then we get to like some fun, again, like this is I guess where you see like the adventurous sitcom-y stuff where they're like, okay, old George, now in order for us to capture Brent, we're gonna use you and have you pretend to be a horrible.
Yeah, we're gonna do like this grift.
Exactly.
where we get basically it's like, okay, old George goes with Tom to town and he verbally abuses Tom in front of all the white people. And then Tom pours a dipper of water for Evan Brent. And Evan Brent goes over to the senator and he's like, you see that? He poured me a dipper of water. Everything's going great.
He's so well behaved.
And the senator's like, well, in my experience, whenever everything's going great, it means that someone's hiding something.
Right.
Or a miracle has happened. So let's go ourselves and see if there's a miracle.
Without telling them, we will just go up to the plantation and see how he's actually treating them.
Yeah. And so then they see that old George is verbally abusing everybody at the plantation. Then Lewis has his turn in the spotlight where he says, hey, come check out this fence we built by the pigsty. And old George has, exchanges some racism with the senator and Evan, and they're like, wow, you're doing a great job. And he's like, yeah, thanks. By the way, could you send us some new mules? And they're like, of course, anything for you, fellow racist white guy.
4 mules for another white supremacist? You got it, pal.
Yeah. And then they ride away. And that all feels kind of, it's like fun because then you see that one of the kids was up in the tree signaling to them.
Yeah.
So that they could know that it was happening.
Dude, what is any of this? Is the point where I looked at my time remaining and was like, wait, there's like 5 minutes left in the show. No, this is the ending of Roots?
Yeah. Right. And so then it ends up being this thing.
It's like double ambush.
It feels like Ocean's 11 or something.
Yep.
Where they lure Evan Brent out to the farm, and Tom draws a gun on him, and old George is like, you're stupid, we tricked you, you're so dumb. And then these other white dudes come out from behind the thing, and he's like, what, do you think I'd show up alone? Here are my white dudes. And then they bring him to the barn, and then
everyone's in the barn. The barn is locked though, and he's gonna break in the door down.
Yeah, and then Chicken George, they throw chickens at Evan Brent, and then Chicken George comes out with his gun, and he's like, put your guns down. We were talking, and we were like, what if the first plan fails? And I was like, well, you got to have another plan.
That's what I always say, is make a second plan.
It's like, what is this? And then Evan Brent is like, who are you?
He literally is like, who the fuck are you?
We haven't met. And then it's all of that just is like, cathartic, I think. And again, I obviously am ill-equipped to speak to like the emotional resonance of this moment, and if that is like as a black viewer, if that is like a scene where you're like, fuck yeah, this is awesome,
finally,
or if it feels stupid, I don't know. To me, I had fun watching it, but it also was like, it felt really light. I don't know. But it's the same thing we're talking about, where it's like finding the right tone for this is so impossible. And then it does end up with one more moment of, I think, really genuine gravity, which is they tie Evan Brent to the tree, and Tom is holding the whip, and he has this moment where he has to decide what is he going to do.
Right.
And he decides to not whip Evan Brent and to whip the ground next to him instead. Which is meant to be, I think it's meant to be portrayed to us, the audience, as like a moment of growth or a moment of him taking the high road, to sort of contrast with him killing Brent's brother in the previous episode, and to sort of say, like, you know, I'm better than you and I'm not going to do to you what you did to me. And I think that that's powerful, but then it also feels goofy again when they're leaving, and then Chicken George goes up to talk to Evan Brent and is like, hey, my son did a pretty great thing there. If you come near us, I'll kill you. And Evan Brent, at this point, he isn't mad. He's just sort of like, okay, all right.
Oh, jeez.
Oh, golly. He's like a Scooby-Doo villain or something. He's like,
I mean, they
okay.
do leave him to die. Like, ostensibly, they just leave him tied up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they'd be able to, you know, wiggle out or whatever.
True, eventually.
But it did feel sort of easy that, and obviously I think what's important is that when he's tied to the tree, it's revealing that, like, him being violent towards African American people is not an act of that shows him being powerful. He's a coward,
Right.
And his true colors are shown in the moment where the roles are reversed. And whereas Tom met that that physical assault with dignity, Brent has absolutely no dignity whatsoever. He's like a crying mess, basically. But it does feel sort of like, yeah, we tied up the bad guy, and he's like, oh, I'm gonna get you, you rascally kids.
They're like, let's get the fuck out of Dodge, yada da 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 da, and they like drive away in their fun carriage. All the family gets to go together, and I have a point I'm gonna make here, but like they all pack up in the carriage, and they find themselves in Lauderdale County, Tennessee, and on the ride there, Chicken George one final time recounts the story of Kunta Kinte, the words that they learned from the Mandinka tribe, the story of Kizzy, the story of Chicken George, the story of Tom, and all of their family members, and how they originated from Africa, and they can't forget where they came from. And my point is that, and I don't know, I'd love to be challenged on this by someone more informed than me, maybe, but Snoop Dogg's biggest critique of Roots is that it's a story about Black suffering, and my biggest critique of Roots is that it's not. Or that it ends as not being that, and that it ends a little nice. But I think the true answer is that it's much more complicated than that, and that it's about both things. But the way that it's about Black success is like a very small scale, arguably myopic version of a success where this doesn't solve anything, but this is a family that has found a happiness for themselves, truly, genuinely, and sincerely.
Yeah, well, and I think the sad truth is that if you're looking for like systemic success, those stories are exceedingly rare in American history.
Correct.
Right. And so, I mean, it is really a tough thing because like this family is able to have their freedom, it seems like. And I think when we watch The Next Generations, we'll see how that ends up playing out. But like for this family, this is like a very, very happy, hopeful moment. And you want to honor that and pay homage to that and express that those moments of happiness are possible. But it does feel that when you end there, you're sort of saying like, and the moral of the story is they lived happily ever after, the end. Which just oversimplifies things, I think.
further simplified by the fact that I don't know if it's because they didn't know that they were going to get another series or not, but the second half of the Roots novel isn't adapted in this series. It's what ends up getting turned into the Next Generations. But
Yeah,
in this
so
one,
I think I've been looking into this, and I think we maybe misunderstood what's in the novel Roots.
okay.
Because I think that the book ends here too, actually.
Oh?
I'm pretty sure that that's the case.
Okay.
Because,
where does the Schmoop summary end?
well, let me see if I can find it. So if I'm looking at the Schmoop summary here, this is us reliving our high school days. Just kidding. I read most of the books in high school, I think. Not in college, but in high school I did. Mm. So if I skip to the last couple chapters here in this summary, chapters 116 to 120. Oh, well, never mind.
Okay, so Next Generations is in the thing.
Yeah, it's like pretty short towards the end of the book. It looks like it kind of
zooms
in a similar way to how it zooms here, and then Roots: The Next Generation is like based on those parts of the book Roots, and also like interviews with Alex Haley and like a beginning draft of a memoir of his or something like that.
Which is exciting. I mean, this ends though with Alex Haley himself narrating the ending and then coming onto the screen and basically saying, so Chicken George died, Matilda died before he did. He had a child, or Tom had a child who grew up and then had a daughter, and she grew up and had a kid, and she was my great grandmother, and her that child eventually was me. Hi, I'm Alex Haley, the writer of a book called Roots. And then it just ends, and it's like, can I get like one more sentence where Haley is like, hey guys,
like, tell us why you wrote it, or what you thought the book meant to you, or something.
It literally is just, I made the book that this is based on, me, Alex Haley.
Good night.
Bye.
Well, let me walk off screen now.
Maybe it was a time thing. I don't know. This was like a 2-hour finale or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's like, but it's just very like, and all like the black and white photos of like, and then 100 years of history happened that we're not going to show you. Anyways, bye. Like, it's kind of silly. Yeah. But ultimately, I enjoyed Roots. I think I think what I valued mostly, or the most, is how it's made me reconsider not only my own personal history, but like the way that we've historically learned about and talked about slavery in the United States.
Yeah.
And the slave trade, and how much more complicated it was, even in this like relatively simple, enjoyable, popcorny story about family.
Yeah, definitely.
But that's what we got for now. As Magellan said, we'll formally announce it now. We've decided after much deliberation that we owe it to ourselves and to the listeners to push our RootsChatz journey a little bit further, and we're going to be covering Roots: The Next Generations, which was 7 episodes that aired, I think, 2 years after Roots, so we're going to be in like 79. And it ends up mostly, I think, focusing on Alex Haley. Like, there's a couple episodes on him, but it's also the people that get to him and the civil rights movement.
Yeah, it takes us from the 1880s up through to the 1960s, so it covers about an 80-year span.
And most notably, in that forget who wrote it, but the piece I was talking about earlier, where the guy was like, the white actors are intentionally supposed to be nice people in real life. He also mentioned that like the biggest difference between Roots and the Roots Next Gen is Roots was actually filmed on a comparatively very low budget for its time, for a 70s miniseries. Hence the like terrible old people makeup and the like terrible lighting every time it's nighttime is like they just filmed it on the cheapo. And the Next Generations is like one of the highest budget miniseries compared to like accounting for inflation of its time. So they like they threw money at the project. Yeah. Which is exciting. Like, what does money end up doing to this series? How do they change the way it's filmed and the story is told and what? But I'm really curious about it. And it sounds like we're going to be watching, 2 episodes next week?
Yeah, so this is a lot more straightforward, the way the parts break down, because there's just 7 parts. They're each were originally aired in 2-hour chunks. And I think the home video releases are like an hour and a half or so.
So we're watching commercials, right?
Yeah, so we're watching parts 1 and 2. Part 1 covers the 1880s, and part 2 covers the turn of the 20th century.
Fun.
Let me take a look at the summaries and see if they spoil anything.
Thank you. I love it when you do that. I get so randy when you do that, Magellan.
Well, I'm glad. That's awesome.
Who's Randy?
Who's Randy? Okay, so these
are like nothing.
These are fine. Yeah, I'll read these. These are fine.
Go for it.
Okay, so next week we're watching parts 1 and 2 of Roots: The Next Generations. First, part 1, Tom Harvey assumes the leadership of the Black community in Henning, Tennessee from his aging father, Chicken George.
Awesome.
I watched the first few minutes of this, and they recast Chicken George, by the way.
Oh,
which is kind of a bummer, because I think Ben Vereen did a great job, but
yeah,
we will see how that goes. And then part 2, Tom Harvey's daughter, Cynthia, falls in love with Will Palmer, a railroad worker who soon lands a job at the lumber company.
Fun.
Yeah.
I was curious if they were going to focus on Bud or the daughter, so it's good to hear that they mixed it up and didn't do another guy generation. Not there's anything wrong with that. I just like the mix up. Very nice. And again, I'm glad that I don't have to, because I had downloaded the or legally acquired the like 45-minute cuts, and it was kind of a pain to be like, all right, where do I hit pause for the week and that kind of thing. So should be a pretty easy breezy watch, folks. Not necessarily. I mean, it's still Roots, so we're gonna be sad and realistic and acknowledge our failings as white folks, but that's what this show is about this season. So thank you, folks, for that. Magellan, let's take it to the plug zone if you don't mind.
Let's do it. So you can get in touch with the show in a number of different ways. You can email us, chatspod@gmail.com. You can send us questions, comments, suggestions for things you'd like us to cover in the future. Or if you just want to say hi, you can do that too. You can also follow us and message us if you so choose on Twitter, twitter.com/chatspod. You can join a community of fellow listeners over at reddit.com/r/chatspod. Currently, the folks over on the subreddit are rewatching our very first Chats season, Scape Chats, covering Farscape. So that's a fun little throwback Thursday time that you can have there. Throw Chats Thursday time that you can have there. And then if you, by the way, all instances of Chatspod are spelled CHATZPOD. And then if you would like to support the show, we do have a Patreon over at patreon.com/chatspod, where if you give us $1 a month, you'll get access to some of the backlog of Patreon stuff, plus currently running series that I'm doing on the X-Files called the Chats Files. At $3 a month, you get access to the majority of the backlog, plus 3 new bonus episodes every month that could range in topic between movie commentaries, piloting other shows, or just talking about whatever we feel like talking about. And then at $5 a month, you get all of that plus the full backlog of other stuff, plus our undying gratitude. And we've been saying this throughout the episode, the RootsChatz, but we do not believe that we are the most important place for your money to be going. So if you are tight on cash and in lieu of supporting the Patreon, you would like to give that money to a worthy cause, for example, the Equal Justice Initiative, the NAACP, local bail bond organizations, or community, what's the word I'm trying to think of, Alan? Mutual aid funds, thank you. Or other sources like that. If you do that and then send us, whatever, a receipt or something, you don't have to show us how much you donated, but just show us in some way that you did that. We'll give you a link to access all of our Patreon stuff without you going through Patreon. So that's an open suggestion or offer for folks who would prefer to do that as opposed to giving us that money instead.
Arrest the people who shot and killed Breonna Taylor as well. That's my plug for the world today. But also, we have our own special plug segment here, Magellan. we have something called Chatsums, where every week at the end of the episode, for people who are wonderful and decide to listen all the way to the very end, we recommend, instead of our own work, things that we like, things that we recommend, shows, movies, activities, things like that. And they're called Chatsums, and I want to know what your Chatsum is.
I have two. The first is, this is something that you actually suggested I watch a while ago, and I finally got around to it.
I love it when that works.
I listened to the podcast Good One, which I think I've talked about before, which is where Jesse David Fox from Vulture interviews comedians about like different bits that they've done in their stand-up or sketches or whatever. And this week he had on Jenny Slate, who I think is so funny and delightful. And I've really liked Jenny Slate for a long time. And she was talking about her latest special called Stage Fright. So I watched Stage Fright, and it is great. It is very, very endearing. And she intersperses her stand-up with like almost a short film of her talking to her family members and trying to like understand who she is at this turning point in her life where she's like in her 30s and she feels like she's starting over, and like the world is full of misogynists, and you know, how do you live as a woman in a patriarchal society and all this stuff. It's really, really great. So I highly recommend Jenny Slate's Stage Fright. Yeah.
Chatsalon 5, episode 65, the season 5 recap.
Did you suggest it?
I totally did, but I also suggested advent calendars, so you're fine. And also, it's so good, you guys. It warms my heart that John did watch it, because there's nothing better than getting your friend to watch a thing that you recommend. But yeah, definitely check out Stage Fright. I'm going to allow you to reach out on that because...
Well, yeah, I also have a fresh Chatsum.
Oh, give me a fresh, because you already give me like 11 every week, and I have to jam our Chatsum doc with them. So sure, go ahead.
So,
King, you stand him.
Poets.org you can sign up for like a mailing list where they send you a poem a day. And recently there was a poem a day that I got in my inbox from this poet named Ronaldo V. Wilson. Mm-hmm. And it's a poem called Ed Asner. And I want to read you Ronaldo Wilson's description of the poem and then read you the poem because it's one of those poems that's like hard to parse, and I'm still working on it and trying to figure it out, but it's short, so I wanted to share it. But this is the like about section that Ronaldo Wilson wrote about it. They say, Ed Asner is from a cycle of poems that explores a kind of quotidian whiteness as expressed through North American, U.S. 70s televisual and current pop iconography as influence. The poems are intended to act as sonic, sculpted responses to questions of memory and desire. Between modes of critique and play, I enact this work as a means to explore race, gender, power, and representation.
Huh? Excuse me? What could this possibly be?
So it's not going to be clear. It's not going to be clear, but okay. I think it's interesting.
Sure.
Okay. Ed Asner. Style. Grind me Nautica, Vic Tayback, line chef, para Alice, arm hair, 4 sausage, and anchor tat. Snatch, a silvered chest, V-neck, sleep hard, wheezy, zebra, jive, turkey. Essen, how do you do that? Glimpse, a tad, pecking the surface glaze, or dove, men plus care. I not be puppy breath, tan streak down the cheek, scar, or Bowie's base. Vanilla ice, tricks a pompadour. Jim Carrey, a detour, when slips the tongue. Airborne pellet in seltzer fizz, Ed. Father had a junk business, barrels of jimmied pistols. They wouldn't fire, but they were good for kids. I'm still trying to figure out what it means, but it's really good.
I got to parse that for the rest of my life.
It's really good.
It sounds like he's referencing a bunch of the works that Ed Asner was featured in.
Yeah.
And then okay, that's great. That's really great. Thank you for sharing that. That's Ed Asner by Ronaldo V. Wilson?
Yep.
Perfect. I love it. So I'll end with my chatsum, which is basically for the folks at home to do what Alex Haley recommends you do at the end of this series, which is to look into your own history, whether you are white, whether you are the child of an immigrant, whether you are anyone who has access to the internet and your family history in some way. Dig into it, because you're very likely, unfortunately, not going to find this sort of like beautiful, long stretching arc that Haley supposedly did with his family coming from the Gambia to the United States. But what you might find is a lot of interesting stuff about your family and even your parents, like just going one generation up, how much you didn't know about your own family. And so for folks at home, just as a little bit of background for myself, I did this in the past week. I was asking my folks at dinner one night, where do we come from? How far back does it go? And it's complicated because my parents both were raised in a small village in Western Syria. And to my knowledge, for most of my life, it's gone as far back as they know in that village. I'm not going to like reveal anything about it specifically, but basically I was asking them about like what they've done in their life. Like I sometimes forget that like my dad served in the military for a couple of years. And part of the reason he came to the States was to like get out of the loop of just like working manual labor jobs that the military afforded him to do. And then my mom was a successful librarian, but also wanted to like get out of a dead end job. So, learning about my parents was great. But then I was like, okay, I know that on my mom's side, my grandfather was a successful tailor, and on my dad's side, his father was worked in owned an oil factory, like an olive oil processing factory, that my dad worked at for a while. And I was like, okay, well, like I got the pleasure to meet my grandparents when I was very young, but like, where does it go beyond that? And on my dad's end, he was like, well, I know my great grandmother. His grandmother, I know her name. I don't know anything about her, but she lived in the village. And then he goes, well, my great-grandfather built the church that is like the center of their village. Like one of the things that's like a really cool identifying feature of the village my family's from is that there's like this huge stone church that is ringing bells very loudly every morning, and they have service every Sunday because it's a Christian community primarily.
Can I, before you finish your story, can I just say something?
Yes.
The man who adopted my grandmother on my dad's side also built a church that's like a centerpiece of the community.
I want to build a church. Let's build a church.
Yeah.
Instead of we bought a zoo, we built a church. Maybe that's what brought us together. Isn't that beautiful? So he knows that guy, he built a church, but for him, further than that, it's like, and then they just lived here for a while. Because the thing about being from a country like Syria is like your history. It's kind of different than like, Kunta knows, his parents and his grandparents, but like, I don't know how much of his history in the Gambia he knew about, but like everybody in America knows that as far back as him. They don't know much beyond him and maybe his parents.
Right.
But for me, because like my family has been living in Syria for presumably like hundreds of years, it goes back to the beginning of time. Like it just rewinds all the way. And that's not to say that they were there forever. The most interesting thing I learned personally was when I was asking my mom, I'm like, where did your family go? Like beyond your father being a tailor and all this. And I believe it was her grandmother, who was married. This is buck wild, man. This was like the most interesting I learned at a very young age, like in her late teens, to my mom's grandfather, and he had to flee the country to escape the Second World War. And he left at like 16, 17 or something, or 20, I think even, and went to Argentina and stayed there until he was 80, and then came back on a boat and came back to the village, and hardly anyone recognized him. And he was like, I'm home. And like, my mom says that she would always remember her grandmother being terrified to be sleeping in the same bed with someone that she's being told was her husband, but she doesn't know if that's necessarily true.
Wow.
And I was like, because there's no records.
Wow.
There's no proof of this guy exists. He doesn't have an ID. Like, what the hell is that? So she just was like, yeah, it was like, so she like, she's like, as a kid, like we would laugh about like, oh, how grandfather, like we never really knew him that well. But like, it's because he was gone for like decades in a country that we don't know about. So my family did like at some point live in on another continent. And she just came back.
Wow.
And then I'm like, well, where's like the family tree? And she's like, well, a lot of those public records, unfortunately, are kept in places, like in public city halls or whatever, in books that just like either were stolen very commonly or burned in conflict. So like, yeah, entire family trees are just gone, and there's no recovering that, and it's sad, but too bad. It's like the hard end of like, even though it's 2020, and you'd think we have like all these resources to like stretch our timeline as back as it can go. And I'm sure if I dug deeper, I could find more. I'm positive of that. But just the cursory being question of like, how far back do you guys know? And both of them were like, it's kind of like 2 generations, and then it's a huge fucking question mark. I'm like, what? And yeah, my great grandfather being a military dodger. It's just so, I didn't know. So you really can. It's as easy as like call your parents and ask them, right? Like, where did we come from? But I'm really curious to like maybe talk to a cousin or something and see if I could ever find anything further back. But it's a worthwhile endeavor. You learn a lot about yourself too in learning about where your family comes from. So that's Roots, baby. That's Roots Chats. We're going to come back for more Roots next week. But thank you, as always, to Mr. Magellan for being the rock to my very hard place. And thank you, dear listener, for listening to this episode of Roots Chats. Peace.